Section 1. A show that quietly changed everything. There is something about the night that softens things. The hard edges of the day grow a little blurry. The urgency that seems so important in the morning starts to feel like something that belongs to a different person, someone who can deal with it tomorrow. And in that softened, quieter state, stories have a way of getting in deeper than they can during the noise of the afternoon. So settle in. Let the weight of wherever you are hold you gently. Because tonight we are going to talk about a cartoon. A cartoon that, depending on who you ask, was either one of the most quietly revolutionary pieces of children's media ever made, or a deeply flawed, frustrating, often contradictory show that promised more than it delivered. And the truth, as is usually the case with things that actually matter, turns out to be somewhere more interesting than either of those positions. The truth is that Steven Universe was all of those things at once. And the conversation it sparked was one of the loudest, most passionate, most genuinely complicated fandoms in the history of animation. But let us not begin at the controversy. Let us begin at the beginning, which is the only place that makes any sense. It was 2013. Cartoon Network was in a particular kind of creative bloom. Adventure Time had already proven that a children's animated show could carry genuine emotional weight, that it could be weird and sad and hopeful and funny all at once. Regular Show had done something similar in a different register. The network was, for a moment, a place where unusual things could happen. And into that moment stepped Rebecca Sugar, a former storyboard artist and writer on Adventure Time, with a pitch for something she had been developing for years. Something that began, in its earliest form, as a deeply personal project. A story about her relationship with her younger brother, Steven. A story about a boy who was gentle and good and who loved the people around him almost to a fault. A story about grief and found family and the particular weight of being loved by someone who is no longer there to love you back. Rebecca Sugar became, in 2013, the first woman to solo create a Cartoon Network original series. That fact mattered, not just as a biographical detail, but as a signal about what kind of show this was going to be. Steven Universe was going to be made from a different angle than most animated shows. It was going to be personal in a way that few animated series allowed themselves to be. The crystal gems Garnet, Amethyst, Pearl were characters who carried history, who had fought battles, who had experienced loss, who had complicated feelings about the child they had been tasked with raising. A child who was the son of their leader, a leader who was gone. And Steven himself was something unusual in children's animation. A protagonist defined not by bravery or cleverness or physical strength, but by his capacity for kindness. His superpower, in the most literal sense, was a healing ability. He fixed things. He softened things. He reached toward people who had been hardened by pain and found ways to make them feel safe enough to open up. The show began airing on the 4th of November 2013, with a pilot episode that had actually been produced much earlier and had premiered at San Diego Comic-Con in 2013 to significant audience enthusiasm. And from the beginning, it had a particular quality that made it feel different from other animated shows airing on the same network. It was slow, sometimes in a way that American cartoons rarely allowed themselves to be. It was interested in small moments, a conversation on a beach, a lazy afternoon in a barn, a drive through town at night with the same level of craft and care it gave to grand cosmic battles and alien confrontations. Its music, composed largely by Sugar herself along with key contributors including Jeff Liu, Ivy Tran, and the duo known as Sura Shu, was tender and strange and often heartbreakingly beautiful in ways that stuck with viewers for years. Songs arrived not as interruptions to the narrative but as extensions of it, as moments when the emotional logic of a scene outpaced what dialogue alone could carry. It also almost immediately began to do something that felt genuinely new in children's animation. It began to tell a story about queer love and queer identity, in terms that were not purely metaphorical, not easily coded away, not simple to dismiss or ignore. The gems were, by their nature as beings who existed entirely outside the human gender binary, presented as female-coded but essentially genderless in their own cosmology. Their relationships with one another, their fusions, which the show eventually revealed to be physical and psychological manifestations of their emotional connections, carried a weight and an intimacy that read, unmistakably, as romantic. This was not accidental. Rebecca Sugar has spoken at length about her own queer identity and about the show as an expression of that identity and those experiences. The show was not attempting to sneak something past the gatekeepers while maintaining plausible deniability. It was making an argument, openly and persistently, that love between beings of the same gender was beautiful and powerful, and deserving of the same epic mythological treatment that heterosexual love received in every other piece of media children were likely to consume. The early seasons of Steven Universe built their audience slowly. It was not an instant sensation. The first season was uneven by some critical measures. The pacing could be frustrating, the episodic structure sometimes felt disconnected from the larger mythology. The show was slowly constructing underneath the surface. But there was something about it that got under people's skin. Viewers who found it began to feel a particular kind of ownership over it, the way you feel ownership over a piece of music that feels like it was made specifically for you, like it somehow knew you were there waiting for it. And then the second season arrived, and the show began to pull together the threads it had been spinning since the beginning. The larger story of the gems, of the homeworld from which they had come, of the war that had shaped all of their lives in ways they were still recovering from thousands of years later, began to come into focus. The audience grew, and then grew some more, and then kept growing in ways that surprised even the people making the show. By 2015, Steven Universe had become something larger than a cartoon. It had become a community. The fandom that had gathered around it was, in many ways, one of the most passionate and creatively prolific in the entire age of social media. Tumblr was, in those years, the beating heart of that community. Fan art appeared in torrents that never seemed to stop gorgeous, painstakingly detailed, wildly inventive work that rivaled professional illustration in its ambition. Fan fiction explored corners of the show's world that the show itself had not yet reached, sometimes predicting plot developments with unsettling accuracy. Fan theories constructed elaborate architectures of meaning from every detail in every frame, from background elements to color choices to the particular way a character held their weapon in a moment of stress. The community was, at its best, a genuinely collaborative and generative space, a place where people who had felt unseen by mainstream media found each other and made something together. But communities built on that kind of intensity, on love that feels like it has personal stakes, on representation that feels like recognition of something you had been told did not exist, on a story that people have incorporated into their sense of who they are and what they are worth. Those communities carry particular pressures alongside their particular gifts. The same passion that produces extraordinary creativity can, under certain conditions and with certain triggers, produce extraordinary cruelty. The same depth of investment that makes people stay up until 3 in the morning, finishing a painting of their favorite characters, can make them act with terrible ugliness when they feel that what they love is being threatened, or misrepresented, or failed by the very people who created it. And Steven Universe, over the years of its run, would generate controversies that became case studies in how online fan communities can go catastrophically wrong. It would generate moments of genuine ugliness alongside moments of genuine grace. It would produce debates that were, sometimes, genuinely important about representation, about the responsibilities of creators toward their audiences, about what we owe each other as members of the same community, and at other times, genuinely unhinged, spiraling into territory that had nothing to do with any cartoon and everything to do with the particular pressures of the internet in the 2010s? What makes a controversy in a fandom? Sometimes it is a creative decision the audience does not like. Sometimes it is behavior by a creator or someone associated with the show. Sometimes it is behavior by the fans themselves directed at each other or at the people who made the thing they love. Sometimes it is an external force, a network decision, a scheduling choice, a censorship action in one country or another that reveals something uncomfortable about the world the show exists inside. The controversies of Steven Universe were, over the years of its run, all of these things and more. They ranged from deeply serious incidents that touched on mental health, on the real-world consequences of sustained online harassment, on the lived experience of LGBTQ people navigating a media landscape that was slowly becoming more accepting but was not there yet to genuinely absurd, the kind of thing that is almost impossible to explain to anyone who was not present in that specific fandom, in that specific moment, that requires layers of context about the emotional temperature of the community in a particular week or month that make the attempt to describe it feel like explaining a very vivid dream to someone who was nowhere near it. That is what we are going to do tonight. We are going to go through all of it. We are going to take the whole complicated, beautiful, ugly, passionate, and genuinely exhausting story of the Steven Universe fandom and lay it out carefully, the way you might lay out the contents of a very old box before you begin to understand what they add up to. We are going to try to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, what it says about fandom culture and the internet, and the particular pressures of being a queer show in a culture that was not entirely ready to embrace what that meant, about what it means to love a piece of art so much that you lose your perspective on it, about what it means to create something that carries the weight of other people's identity, and what happens when that weight becomes too much for anyone to carry with grace. This is a long story. It is, in some ways, the story of an entire era of online culture compressed into the lifespan of one animated series. But it begins with a boy on a beach, and a rose quartz gem embedded in his stomach, and a world that was waiting, without quite knowing it was waiting, for something exactly like this to arrive. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone on the other side of the planet, in a completely different time zone and a completely different kind of night, is listening to the same story in the same quiet moment. And if you want to be here for all of it, for every section of this very long journey through everything Steven Universe was and did and left behind, go ahead and subscribe. We have a great deal more ground to cover together. Section 2, the fandom that loved too hard. To understand anything that happened in the Steven Universe fandom, any of the controversies, any of the eruptions, any of the moments of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty, you have to first understand what the fandom was, at its core, before it became anything else. You have to understand the specific kind of love that drew people to this show, and why that love was different, in important ways, from the love people felt for other animated series of the same era. Because the stakes felt different to people inside this particular community. And when the stakes feel different, people behave differently. The Steven Universe fandom, in its early years, was unusually dominated by queer people, by people managing various mental health challenges, by people who had felt underrepresented or invisible in mainstream media their entire lives. This is not a generalization offered carelessly. It is something that the fandom itself talked about constantly and openly, with a kind of collective recognition that felt, to many people inside the community, like a relief. People would say in the comments of fan art posts and in the replies to discussions on Tumblr, things like, "This show saved my life. This show made me understand something about myself that I had not been able to articulate before. This show gave me language for feelings I had been carrying without names." These are not small claims. These are people describing a piece of media as genuinely transformative in a very personal sense, the kind of transformation that reaches into the architecture of how you understand yourself. And that personal transformation was happening, in many cases, in people who were very young, teenagers, some of them barely into their teens, who were still in the process of figuring out who they were, who were still in environments that may not have been safe for them to be fully themselves, who had found in this cartoon a space that felt welcoming and affirming in a way that the rest of their daily life did not. The gems were queer. The fusions, which the show explicitly framed as manifestations of the quality and character of the relationships between gems, were queer. The show depicted love between female-coded beings as beautiful and powerful and central to the entire mythology it had constructed. For a 13-year-old who was figuring out that she was gay, in a family or a school that was not a safe place for that realization, Steven Universe was not just entertainment she happened to enjoy. It was evidence that she existed, that people like her were worth depicting, that her particular way of being in the world was not a problem to be solved but a thing to be celebrated. That is a great deal to ask of a cartoon. That is, in fact, more than it is fair to ask of any single piece of media, no matter how well made and sincerely intended. But the ask was being made, and the show was, in significant ways, trying to answer it. Rebecca Sugar's sincerity was never seriously in question. The show's commitment to the values it articulated was not performative or cynical. And so the relationship between the show and its most invested viewers developed a particular quality, an intimacy, almost, that was genuinely unusual, a sense of mutual responsibility, of a bond that went beyond the ordinary relationship between a television series and its audience. The show owed them something because it had claimed to see them when so much else had not. And they owed the show something because it had given them something real and rare. The problem with that kind of relationship is that it is not actually a relationship in the full sense of the word. The show's creators could not hear the individual members of the fandom. The individual members of the fandom could not hear the creators, except through the mediated channels of convention panels and social media posts and the occasional interview. The intimacy was real on the fans' side, in the sense that the feelings were real and the impact was real. But it was also, inevitably, one-sided. And one-sided intimacy has a way of curdling into something else when it encounters disappointment. When the show did something a fan did not like, when a plotline did not go the way they had hoped, when a relationship between characters did not develop the way they had invested themselves in imagining, when a character they loved was treated in a way that felt wrong or dismissive, the disappointment was not the mild disappointment of a disengaged viewer who shrugs and changes the channel. It was the specific, sharp, personal disappointment of someone who felt that a person who truly understood them had suddenly, inexplicably, stopped understanding them. The Steven Universe fandom on Tumblr, in those years, had its own internal culture, its own language, its own hierarchies and power structures that were as real as those in any small society. There were fan artists who were enormously influential within the community, whose work was reblogged tens of thousands of times, who had built large audiences around their particular interpretations of the characters and their relationships. There were fan theorists who were followed and quoted and cited for their ability to decode the show's mythology from the clues it embedded in its backgrounds and its music. There were community figures who had become, over time, voices that others listened to and trusted and deferred to on questions of what the show meant and what it was doing. The fandom had the characteristics of a small and very intense society, with all of the social dynamics that implies cliques, conflicts, reputation, status, the complex politics of who was considered in and who was considered out. It also had an intense investment in particular kinds of interpretation. The show's characters were, by design, somewhat open in their visual representation. They were drawn in a stylized way that did not fix their appearance to a single racial or ethnic reading. Their relationships were often ambiguous enough at particular moments to be read in multiple ways. Their personalities had room for fan elaboration that the show itself had not yet filled. This openness was, in many ways, a genuine strength. It invited people in. It made the characters feel like a shared canvas, rather than finished portraits that belonged to someone else. But it also created conditions for intense disagreement because it meant that different parts of the fandom had constructed very different pictures of who these characters fundamentally were, and those pictures felt, to the people who held them, not like interpretations but like facts, not like readings but like realities. And when those realities collided, the collision was not gentle. The shipping culture within the fandom, the communities that formed around particular romantic pairings of characters, was especially intense, even by the standards of other animated fandoms of the same period. The show itself, particularly in its early seasons, was sometimes deliberately ambiguous about romantic relationships, both because it wanted to give itself room to develop those relationships over time, and because, as would later become clear, the network had placed significant restrictions on how explicitly romantic same-sex relationships could be depicted in the content itself. This ambiguity was a kind of gift to shippers, who could build elaborate and genuinely creative cases for their preferred pairings from the available evidence. But it was also a perpetual source of intense conflict, because when different groups of shippers believed genuinely different things about where the show was heading and what it meant, and when those things felt personally significant in ways that were connected to their own identities, the arguments could get very heated, very quickly, and could stay heated for months. There was also, from the beginning, a particular feature of the Steven Universe fandom that would prove consistently troubling as the years went on. The way in which discussions about the show's representation, discussions that were often genuinely important, that raised real questions about race and disability and body image and queerness that deserved serious engagement, could become weaponized in the context of fan conflicts. Because the show had attracted an audience that was, in significant part, made up of people with marginalized identities, and because those people's engagement with the show was often connected to their own lived experience of marginalization, The language of social justice was present in the fandom from its earliest days. And that vocabulary, the vocabulary of harm and representation and accountability and calling things out in the hands of people who were passionate and young and sometimes not entirely in control of the gap between their intentions and their actions, could be turned into a very sharp instrument indeed. This is not a criticism of social justice as a framework, and it needs to be said clearly. The conversations about representation that the Steven Universe fandom had were often genuinely important. The criticisms of the show's racial coding, of the way certain characters were designed and positioned within the narrative, of the limitations of what its representation actually achieved, as opposed to what it promised, these were real criticisms made by thoughtful people, worth engaging with seriously and with intellectual honesty. But in the specific social ecosystem of the Tumblr fandom, those criticisms existed alongside a culture that could, with remarkable and sometimes terrifying speed, transform the language of harm into a tool of harassment. A fan artist could be accused of drawing a character in a way that was insensitive to a particular community, and that accusation could become a signal for hundreds of people to descend on that artist's inbox and public mentions with messages that were not critique and were not dialogue and were not the kind of accountability anyone reasonable would recognize. The framework that was supposed to protect people from harm was being used to harm people. And the people wielding it, in most cases, were not consciously aware of the contradiction. This is the context in which everything that follows happened. Not because it excuses anything it does not, and it is not meant to, but because none of the specific incidents make sense in isolation without it. The Steven Universe fandom was a community of people who cared, deeply, about things that were genuinely worth caring about. Who had found in a cartoon something that meant something real to them, something connected to their survival and their identity and their sense of whether the world had room for people like them, and who were, at the same time, operating in a social environment that had particular features: the anonymous reach of internet platforms, the mob dynamics of social media, the specific emotional volatility of young people navigating identity and community and belonging simultaneously, often without adequate support from the adult world around them, that made it possible for care to turn into something else, something harder and darker, with startling ease and terrible efficiency. What you have to hold on to, as we go through all of this, is that both things were true at once, and neither cancels the other out. The care was real, and so was the darkness, and they came from the same place. The fandom also had an unusual relationship with the creators themselves that deserves attention before we move on. Rebecca Sugar was an accessible public presence at conventions, in interviews, in statements that circulated through the community. Other members of the creative team were often active on social media, engaging with fans, sharing their work, responding to questions, expressing genuine enthusiasm for the community that had formed around what they were making. This access was wonderful in many ways. It made the show feel collaborative rather than handed down from on high, felt like the people who made it and the people who watched it were genuinely in conversation. But it also meant that the crew were not protected, as creators of earlier eras might have been, from the direct and immediate force of the fandom's reactions. When the fandom was grateful, the creators could feel it in real time. And when the fandom was angry, the creators could feel that too, with exactly the same immediacy. This accessibility, as we will see, would eventually have serious consequences for at least one member of the crew who found themselves, without quite understanding how they had gotten there, in the direct path of a storm they had no way to control or escape. Section 3. The Zami Incident. There is a particular quality to the worst things that happen online, a quality of escalation that seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable, but that in the moment feels like it could have been stopped at any of 100 different points along the way. You look at where it ends and you think, how did it get here? And then you trace it back to the starting point, and the starting point is so small, so apparently minor, that the distance between it and where things ended up seems like it could not possibly have been crossed. And yet it was. That quality, that terrible, incremental escalation from something small to something enormous, defines the story that needs to be told in this section. A story about what the Steven Universe fandom did in the fall of 2015, and about the consequences of what it did, and about what those consequences revealed about the community that had formed around a show that was, at its core, about treating people with kindness. Paz was a young artist, still a teenager at the time, who made fan art of Steven Universe characters with genuine skill and evident love for the show. She went by the username Zami070 on Tumblr. Her work was popular within the community. She had a significant following of people who appreciated her art and engaged with it regularly. She drew the characters in her own style, which was, as is true of essentially all fan art, a personal interpretation of the source material rather than a precise reproduction of the show's official aesthetic. Artists bring themselves to their work. That is what makes fan art interesting. The stylistic choices that differentiate one artist's fan art from another's are not deviations to be corrected. They are expressions of a specific person's relationship to the characters and the world they love. At some point in 2015, certain members of the fandom began to take issue with the way Paz was drawing particular characters. The most prominent and sustained criticism focused on her depictions of Rose Quartz, the character who had been Steven's mother, a large, deliberately full-figured character whose body type was an explicit and meaningful part of her design. The show had presented Rose Quartz as beautiful and powerful and regal in a body type that mainstream media rarely depicted as any of those things. For many fans, Rose's physical design was part of what made her representation feel genuinely important, genuinely different from what they were used to seeing. Paz, in some of her fan art, drew Rose in a way that was somewhat thinner than the character appeared in the show's official animation. There is a legitimate conversation available here, one that is worth naming clearly before anything else. The question of how fan artists depict characters whose body types are explicitly part of what makes them meaningful is a real question. It is worth discussing. When a character has been designed with a specific body type that carries specific representational significance that communicates something to audiences who rarely see bodies like that, depicted as heroic and beautiful there, is something worth noting when fan art consistently or significantly departs from that in the direction of conventional beauty standards. These conversations happen in healthy fan communities all the time, and they can be had with care and without cruelty. The topic was not illegitimate. The way it was pursued was, what happened to Paz was not a conversation. It was not critique. It was a coordinated, sustained campaign of targeted harassment that built over weeks into something that defies easy description. At its peak, there were more than 40 dedicated hate blogs on Tumblr, not 40 critical comments, not 40 people who expressed disagreement with her artistic choices, but 40 entire blogs, created specifically and solely for the purpose of expressing hatred toward a teenage girl who made fan art of a cartoon show. She received messages in her inbox telling her she should kill herself. She received threats of physical violence and sexual violence. She received sustained cruelty from multiple directions simultaneously, day after day, for weeks. The people who sent those messages and who ran those blogs were not strangers to the show's values. They were fans. They were people who watched a show about kindness every week. They were people who could tell you exactly what that show believed about how people deserve to be treated. In October of 2015, Paz was hospitalized following a suicide attempt. And from the hospital, as she was recovering, she posted a video. It was called I'm Sorry. In it, she apologized. She apologized to the community that had harassed her. She said she was sorry for the pain that her art had caused. This is one of the most painful things to describe, and it needs to be described plainly. A teenager who had just survived a suicide attempt that was directly connected to weeks of sustained harassment was, from a hospital bed, apologizing to the people who had harassed her. That is what happened. There is no version of that fact that is comfortable to sit with. Rebecca Sugar responded publicly and without equivocation. The harassment was wrong. Full stop. It was the opposite of what the show stood for. It was a failure of the community that had formed around a show whose central message was that people deserve to be treated with gentleness. Ian Jones-Quartey, Sugar's partner and an executive producer on the series, was equally direct. Other members of the crew expressed their horror. The message from the people who made Steven Universe was clear, and it was consistent. This is not what we built this show to produce. This is not what love for this show should look like. What happened to this person was wrong. Paz survived. She continued to make art. She has had a continued online presence, though understandably a more careful and guarded one than before. And the fandom did something like a reckoning in the aftermath. There were long, serious conversations, many of them genuinely thoughtful about the culture that had made this possible, about the way that calling out problematic behavior had become, in the specific ecosystem of Tumblr, a social activity with its own internal reward structures and its own momentum, about the way that the language of progressive social concern, the vocabulary of harm and accountability and representation, had been weaponized in the service of what was, when all of the framing was removed, a targeted harassment campaign against a teenager who drew pictures. These conversations were real and they were necessary, and they produced for a while a genuine shift in how, at least some members of the community, talked about fan art and the people who made it. But the structural features of the fandom that had made the incident possible did not change. The anonymity was still there. The mob dynamics were still there. The specific reward structure of Tumblr, which amplified outrage and gave social status to people who identified and called out problematic behavior, was still there. The intense emotional investment in the show as something personal, as something connected to identity and survival, was still there. Wake-up calls without structural change produced temporary clarity and then, gradually, a return to the conditions that necessitated the wake-up call. The fandom looked at what it had done, felt genuine horror, and then, over the months that followed, drifted back toward the temperature it had been running at before. The lasting effect of this incident on the fandom was complicated and layered. On one hand, it became a reference point, something people cited when conversations started to feel like they were heading somewhere dangerous, a reminder of where that particular road led. On the other hand, it became, in some corners of the community, contested ground. There were people who maintained that the original criticisms of Paz's art had been valid, and that the problem was not the criticism itself but the scale and intensity of the response, as if those two things were fully separable from each other. There were people who felt that the narrative had overcorrected, that people who had made genuine points about body representation were being unfairly blamed for outcomes they had not intended or wanted. These arguments persisted. In some corners of the internet, versions of them are still going on. What is not arguable, what will not become arguable, regardless of how many times the framing shifts, is the fact of what happened. A teenage girl survived a suicide attempt because people in a fandom organized around a show about kindness were cruel to her, deliberately and repeatedly and with sustained intent, in the name of values they claimed to hold. The vocabulary of social justice, the framework of harm and representation that existed in that community to protect vulnerable people, was used against one of the vulnerable people it was supposed to protect. That is a specific failure with a specific shape, and it deserves to be named as such without softening, the show continued. The fandom did not dissolve, but the incident cast a long shadow, a particular kind of unease that never fully dissipated. It was proof of what this community was capable of, and that proof, once given, could not be unaccepted. The fandom that existed after October 2015 was a fandom that knew what it had done. And that knowledge, carried forward into everything that came next, shaped the community in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not, but were always present. Section 4: Shipping Wars and the Jessie Zook Affair. If the events of October 2015 were the clearest example of the fandom at its absolute worst, a moment so extreme that it resisted minimization or rationalization, then what happened in August 2016 was something subtler and, in certain ways, more instructive about how the community operated under lower but more chronic pressures, because it showed how the same dynamics, the same culture of targeted collective displeasure, could operate at a reduced temperature and still produce real harm. And it showed how that harm could be directed not just at anonymous fan artists, but at actual members of the creative team. People who had chosen to be accessible and engaged with the community, and who discovered, in the most direct way possible, what that accessibility cost when the community's attention turned on them. To understand what happened to storyboard artist Lauren Zook, who later came out as Jessie Zook and uses they-them pronouns, you need to understand the shipping culture of the Steven Universe fandom as it existed in the middle years of the show's run. Shipping, the practice of enthusiastically rooting for particular romantic pairings between characters, has existed in some form in fan culture for decades. But the specific environment of social media in the 2010s gave it a new kind of intensity, a new set of social mechanics that amplified both its pleasures and its pathologies. Because platforms like Tumblr made it easy to find others who shared your particular preferences and to build communities around those shared preferences, ship fandoms could develop into full sub-communities with their own internal culture, their own language and traditions, their own emotional investments that ran surprisingly deep. And when two ship communities were effectively in competition for the same character, when the question of who a character would ultimately be paired with felt genuinely unsettled, and different groups of fans had different convictions about the answer, the conflict between those communities could become extreme. The two relevant ships in this story are Lapidot and Amidot. Lapidot referred to a pairing of the characters Lapis Lazuli and Peridot, two gems introduced in the later seasons who had a complicated, evolving relationship with rich emotional subtext that the show had developed with evident care. Amidot referred to a pairing of Amethyst and Peridot, a relationship that the show had also given distinctive texture, a specific emotional dynamic that was different in quality from the Lapis and Peridot dynamic, but equally developed. Both pairings had devoted fan communities. Both had been given enough material in the actual show that they felt like genuine possibilities rather than pure wishful thinking. And the uncertainty about which direction the show would ultimately move in, if it moved in either direction at all, was a source of ongoing and intensifying tension between the two communities. Jesse Zook was a storyboard artist on the show and an active, engaged presence on Twitter where they shared their work and their thoughts and connected with the fandom in the way that many of the show's crew members did during that period. They had been involved in storyboarding episodes that featured Lapis and Peridot, and their enthusiasm for the dynamic between those characters was evident in the way they talked about their work. This is not unusual. Artists who spend sustained time with specific characters develop feelings about those characters, develop investment in their relationships, bring their own emotional responses to the material they work with. Those feelings show in the work, and sometimes they show in how artists talk about the work. In August 2016, the tensions that had been building between the Lapidot and Amidot communities reached a breaking point that found Jesse at its center. The Amidot community, perceiving Jesse's evident enthusiasm for the Lapidot dynamic as evidence that they were actively using their position as a crew member to push the show in a direction that matched their personal preferences, began directing criticism and then pressure at Jesse directly. Accusations accumulated. The framing that gained traction was queerbaiting the accusation that the show was teasing queer relationships it had no genuine intention of following through on, generating investment in pairings it would ultimately refuse to develop. The accusation of queerbaiting is a real and serious one in the context of media criticism. It describes a real pattern of behavior by networks and creators who have historically attracted queer audiences through the implication of queer representation while never actually delivering it, generating emotional investment without the corresponding commitment. The criticism is legitimate and deserves to be taken seriously when it is accurately applied. Applying it to Steven Universe, though, required a particular kind of selective reasoning. This was a show that at that point in its run was the most explicitly queer animated series on American television. It had canonical queer relationships. It had a queer creator who had spoken publicly and at length about her own identity and the show as an expression of it. The charge of queerbaiting, when leveled at this particular show by this particular community, was not a critical observation about a pattern in the text. It was a piece of framing being used to give a shipping dispute the moral weight of a real harm, to transform frustration about a fictional romantic pairing into something that sounded like principled advocacy. With that framing in place, the pressure on Jesse intensified. Messages were sent, posts were written. The collective attention of a large and emotionally invested community was focused on a single person in a way that Jesse could feel in real time because they were active online, because they had made themselves available to the community, because they had built the kind of relationship with the fandom where they could feel its temperature directly. And then Jesse deleted their Twitter. They stepped back from direct engagement with the fandom entirely. Before going, they left a brief statement. They asked people to remember that they were addressing a literal human being. They noted that life existed outside of Steven Universe. They were saying as clearly as it can be said that they were a person and not a symbol, that they deserved to be treated as a person. The fandom's response to Jesse's departure was divided in ways that themselves revealed something about the community's self-understanding. Some people recognized immediately what had happened, saw the pattern repeating. The same machinery of collective pressure that had contributed to the events of the previous year now applied to a member of the creative team rather than a fan artist. Others maintained that Jesse's public engagement with fandom, including their evident investment in a particular ship, had been professionally inappropriate, that the criticism directed at them had been legitimate, that they had in some sense brought the pressure on themselves by choosing to express preferences publicly in a way that affected how fans perceived the show's direction. There is something worth examining in that second position. Not to accept it, but to understand the reasoning. If a crew member's public statements about their personal preferences are genuinely influencing the fandom's perception of the show's direction in ways that are misleading or unfair, there could be legitimate grounds for concern. But the distance between that concern and a coordinated campaign of pressure directed at an individual until they felt compelled to leave their platform is not a short distance. It is a very long distance, and the fact that it was crossed as readily as it was tells us something important about the mechanics of the community's responses to perceived grievances. The Jesse Zook affair had a lasting effect on how the show's crew engaged with the fandom. In the months and years that followed, crew members became significantly more careful about what they expressed publicly on social media. The accessibility that had been one of the distinctive and genuinely appealing features of the show's relationship with its community, the sense that you could actually, in some meaningful way, talk to the people making this thing, began to diminish. The people who made the show were still there, still working, still invested in the material. But the distance between them and the community grew, and the growth of that distance was a direct consequence of what the fandom had done. The community, in its intensity, had pushed away some of the very thing it claimed to value. There is a specific irony in all of this that is worth sitting with. The Steven Universe fandom had formed, in no small part, around a sense of recognition, the feeling that this show saw people who were usually unseen, that it extended empathy to people who were usually denied it, that it treated people gently in a world that often did not. And yet the fandom's behavior toward Jesse Zook and toward Paz before them was a failure of precisely that empathy. The fandom could see the gems. It could see the emotions and histories and complexities of fictional characters with extraordinary clarity and care and love. But it was having real difficulty seeing the actual human beings in front of it, the artists, the crew members, the other fans as fully human, as deserving of the same gentle treatment the show was teaching its viewers to extend to everyone they encountered. The show was offering one lesson. The fandom, repeatedly, was learning another, and the gap between those two things would continue to define the community through everything that followed. Section 5. The Bismuth episode and the discourse that never ended. Not all of the controversies in the Steven Universe fandom were about the behavior of the community toward individuals. Some of them were about the show itself, about creative decisions that divided audiences in ways that were intellectually genuine, that raised real questions about what the show was trying to say and whether it was saying it with the clarity and rigor it claimed to possess. And of all the episodes that generated controversy over the entire run of the series, there is one that stands distinctly apart. One episode that the fandom has consistently, across years and across different corners of the internet, referred to as the single most divisive piece of the show. One episode that crystallized, in a remarkably compact form, nearly every major debate about the show's values, its execution, and its relationship to the real-world political and racial dynamics it was clearly attempting to engage with. That episode is Bismuth, and the arguments it generated have never fully resolved. Bismuth aired on the 4th of August 2016. It was the 100th episode of the series, and it was a double-length special, an event episode, the kind of broadcast that signals to an audience that something significant is being attempted. It introduced a new character, Bismuth, an ancient gem who had been one of the original crystal gems, one of the warriors who had fought alongside Rose Quartz in the rebellion against the homeworld's colonization project thousands of years before the events of the show. She had been missing for those thousands of years, and she was found, at the episode's beginning, preserved inside a bubble within Lion's pocket dimension suspended, waiting, having had no idea that the war had ended or that Rose was gone or that the world had changed entirely while she slept. Bismuth was voiced by Uzo Aduba, who at that point was receiving enormous critical attention for her work on Orange is the New Black. Her performance in this episode was one of the finest things the show ever produced in terms of voice acting, rich and warm and immensely powerful. Carrying a character who was simultaneously exuberant and deeply wounded, joyful at being free and in pain about everything that freedom had cost her. Bismuth had been a blacksmith, a maker of weapons, a gem who expressed her love and her loyalty through the act of creation. She rebuilt the crystal gems as weapons with obvious pleasure and care. She cooked for everyone, filling the forge with warmth and food, and the particular kind of generosity that people express when they have been lonely for a very long time and are desperate to give something. In the early parts of the episode, she was a genuinely wonderful presence, someone the audience immediately wanted more of. And then came the breaking point. Over the course of the episode, Bismuth revealed to Steven a weapon she had designed and built in secret during the war, not a weapon to poof gems, which was what the crystal gems' standard arsenal did, temporarily destabilizing a gem's physical form and forcing them to retreat into their gemstone to regenerate. The breaking point was designed to shatter, to permanently destroy a gem's gemstone, to kill, in the only sense that mattered in this cosmology. She had designed it specifically to be capable of shattering a diamond, the most powerful class of gem, seemingly invulnerable by any conventional means. Her argument for it was, when examined on its own terms, not easy to simply dismiss. The homeworld's forces were effectively infinite. Every gem that the crystal gems poofed simply regenerated and returned to the fight. The crystal gems were fighting a war of attrition they could not win by the rules Rose had set. Bismuth had looked at those rules and found them insufficient, had concluded that they reflected a kind of moral luxury available only to someone in Rose's specific position, someone whose safety was more guaranteed, whose losses were more recoverable than the losses sustained by her followers. She wanted to fight with weapons that could actually end the threat, permanently. Rose had refused. Rose's philosophy, established from the show's earliest episodes as central to who she was one of non-lethal resistance. She fought to protect, not to destroy. She believed in the fundamental worth of every gem and in the possibility of change, and those beliefs precluded the use of a weapon designed to end lives permanently. When Bismuth had pushed her on this, had argued that the philosophy was a luxury, that the war required different tools, Rose had done something that the episode asks us to reckon with. She had defeated Bismuth in a fight and sealed her inside a bubble and told the other crystal gems that Bismuth had gone missing in battle. She had hidden her away, in secret, without explanation, for thousands of years. Steven, confronted with the breaking point, refused it on the same grounds Rose had, and Bismuth, feeling the specific agony of being refused twice by the same person in the same way, attacked him. The fight was brutal. Steven ultimately used Rose's own sword to poof Bismuth and then, following Rose's decision, rebubbled her and sent her back to Lion's Mane. The cycle repeated. Bismuth returned to sleep. The fandom's response was immediate and sustained and produced some of the most substantive, critical engagement with the show that had ever appeared in the community. The racial coding argument was articulated quickly and with considerable precision. Bismuth was a character whose name, visual design, voice performance, and cultural associations were coded as black in ways that were clearly deliberate. She was, in the terms that the show's visual language had established, black in the way that multiple characters in the show were racially coded without being explicitly identified. And here was the show presenting a black-coded character arguing for militant resistance against an oppressive colonial power, being told by a white-coded character that her approach was morally wrong, and then being imprisoned without trial, without explanation to her community, in secret for thousands of years as a result of that disagreement. The parallel to the specific history of black resistance in America, to the ways that black advocacy for liberation has been policed and criminalized and characterized as threatening in ways that gentler resistance is not, was not subtle. Whether the show intended this parallel, whether it was making a deliberate argument about race, or had constructed this dynamic without fully considering its implications, was debated, but the pattern was visible, and the critics who named it were engaged in genuine analysis of something that was genuinely in the text. Women Write About Comics published an essay on the episode's racial dynamics that circulated widely and became one of the central reference texts in the ongoing debate. The essay was engaged with seriously by some parts of the fandom and dismissed angrily by others. It was cited, refuted, cited again, and argued about for months. The debates that gathered around it touched on fundamental questions about how to read texts that engage with political and social dynamics, about whether authorial intent matters, about whether the effects of a narrative are separable from the intentions behind it, about what obligations a show with an explicitly progressive political project has to think carefully about all of the implications of the stories it tells. The other major axis of debate concerned the in-universe fairness of what had happened to Bismuth and what it said about the show's moral framework. Many fans felt that the episode was deeply unfair to her, that it raised a moral question with genuine force and then answered it by having Steven win a fight, using action to resolve a philosophical disagreement that the show had not had the courage to fully engage with on its own terms. They felt that Bismuth deserved more engagement with her ideas, more honest acknowledgement of the ways in which her critique of Rose was valid, more than being defeated and returned to unconsciousness. They felt the show had taken a shortcut. Others argued that the episode was doing exactly what it meant to do, that it did not present Rose's philosophy as simply and cleanly correct, that it acknowledged the genuine tragedy of Bismuth's situation, that the moral complexity was the point rather than an accident. They argued that the show was depicting the genuine difficulty of principled nonviolence, not endorsing it without qualification. They argued that critics were demanding a kind of explicit resolution that would have actually made the episode worse. Bismuth eventually returned in Steven Universe Future, was brought back into the Crystal Gem community, was given more room to exist as a character beyond the moral weight of her debut. Whether her return resolved the questions her debut episode had raised, or simply moved past them, is something people still argue about. The Bismuth episode remains, in the fandom's collective memory, a particularly vivid example of what the show could do when it reached for genuinely difficult material, and of the arguments it generated when the reaching was imperfect, when the execution did not entirely match the ambition, when the show asked a hard question and then reached for an answer that not everyone found adequate. What the episode did, more than any other single piece of the show, was force the fandom to have a serious conversation about what Steven Universe was actually saying, not what it felt like it was saying, not what viewers wanted it to say, but what it was actually saying in the specific details of specific choices. That conversation was, at its best and most careful, exactly the kind of engagement that a piece of media with real moral ambitions deserves to generate, even when, especially when it could not produce agreement. Section 6, Fighting from Inside. LGBTQ Representation and Cartoon Network. There is a story that Rebecca Sugar has told in pieces, across various interviews and convention appearances over the years, about what it was like to make a queer show inside a major American television network in the middle of the 2010s. It is a story that unfolds in increments in network notes, in conversations that could not be had too directly, in creative choices made in response to institutional constraints that the public was largely unaware of for much of the show's run. It is the story of how Steven Universe became the most explicitly queer animated series on American children's television, and of what it actually cost to get there. And it is, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable stories in the history of American animation. From the beginning, Sugar had a clear vision for the show's treatment of queerness. The Crystal Gems were beings who existed entirely outside the human gender binary. They were female-coded in their presentation, but not, in any meaningful sense, gendered in the way human characters are gendered by the biology and social structures of their world. Their emotional and romantic attachments to one another were real, were central to the show's mythology, were not hidden or euphemized but presented as the fundamental basis of the story's most significant relationships. And in particular, the relationship between Ruby and Sapphire, two gems who had been fused as garnet for thousands of years, whose fusion was the most stable and enduring in the show's universe, was, from the moment it was introduced, unmistakably a love story about two beings who had chosen to be together permanently. A love story that read, to every honest viewer who encountered it, as a story about two women. Expressing that clearly, on screen, in a show that aired on Cartoon Network and was targeted at children and families, required navigating institutional constraints that were significant and not always publicly visible. Sugar has spoken about receiving early notes from the network that amounted to, These characters cannot be in a romantic relationship. She was told that if she wanted to maintain the Ruby and Sapphire dynamic, one option was to make Ruby male to introduce a heterosexual framing that would make the relationship acceptable by the standards the network was applying. She refused. She found ways to embed the relationship clearly enough in the show's text that viewers who could read it would read it, while keeping its most explicitly romantic elements below the threshold that would trigger a direct and potentially final confrontation with the network. This is a creative strategy with a long history. Queer artists and creators have used it for as long as queer creators have been making work for mainstream audiences. Put what you can in, make it clear to the audience that can see it while maintaining enough distance to forestall the gatekeepers, push the available space larger with each thing you are permitted to do. It is a strategy born of constraint, and it produces work with a particular quality, a double consciousness, speaking to two different audiences at once, with different degrees of clarity for each. The queer audience reads it clearly. The gatekeepers either do not, or choose not to, or decide that the deniability is sufficient. Sugar has described her approach to getting the Ruby and Sapphire relationship into the show in exactly these terms. She waited until the production was far enough along to be essentially impossible to undo before fully showing the network what she was doing. By the time the first season's finale was in production, the relationship was embedded in the narrative in ways that would have required fundamental structural changes to the story to remove. The network, faced with this reality, allowed it to continue, but they maintained restrictions on how explicitly the relationship could be depicted. No kissing on the mouth. No direct verbal confirmation of a romantic relationship in certain contexts. The show had to find ways to communicate what was happening through implication and visual language, and the emotional charge of the performances, rather than through the direct statement that would have made the network's position untenable. The restrictions were not consistent across all of the network's international markets, and the inconsistency was itself revealing. In 2016, Cartoon Network UK edited a sequence from an episode that depicted Pearl gazing at rose quartz with evident romantic longing, the kind of look that, between a man and a woman, would have registered as unremarkable and been left in without question. The UK cut maintained a nearly identical scene between Greg and Rose, the male and female pairing expressing the same emotional dynamic. Same moment, same function in the story, different genders, and one was acceptable and the other was not. This was censorship, operating on the plainest possible principle. Same-sex romantic feeling is not appropriate for children's audiences, and heterosexual romantic feeling is. The show was being treated differently based purely on the genders of the characters involved, and the differential treatment embodied exactly the message that queer love is less suitable, less appropriate, less real than straight love that the show was constructed to counter. In 2017, the Kenya Film Classification Board banned Steven Universe entirely, characterizing it as content that glorified homosexual behavior. The decision was covered in international press and became part of a broader story about the global landscape that queer-positive media navigates. For the fandom, it was a radicalizing moment of a specific kind, a reminder that the stakes of the show's representation were not only cultural or aesthetic, but genuinely political. That in certain parts of the world, the existence of a show like this was considered not controversial but illegal, not worthy of debate but worthy of prohibition. And then in 2018, with the episode titled Reunited, Steven Universe crossed a threshold that no American children's animated series had crossed before. Ruby and Sapphire were married. The wedding was depicted with every ounce of ceremony and joy and emotional weight the show could bring to bear. It was gorgeous and funny and genuinely moving. It was watched by close to 1 million viewers on its initial broadcast. And in the same episode, the two characters kissed on the mouth, the restriction finally lifted, the thing that had been withheld finally given. The first same-sex wedding in American children's animation. The first same-sex kiss to air on Cartoon Network. Sugar had fought for years, within the constraints of the institution she worked inside, to get to this moment. And when the moment arrived, it felt like what it was. A real thing achieved at real cost. The show went on to win a GLAAD Media Award, the first animated series to receive one, and a Peabody Award, which cited explicitly the show's treatment of LGBTQ themes. These were not merely symbolic recognitions. They were evidence that something measurable had been accomplished. that the show's commitment to its values had moved the needle in ways that institutions dedicated to tracking such things were willing to formally acknowledge. Within the fandom, the gradual disclosure of the extent of the network's restrictions, which Sugar began discussing more openly around 2018, when the show had established enough ground that speaking felt safer, was received with a complicated mixture of responses. There was anger at Cartoon Network, at the institutional constraints that had required the creator to fight so hard for things that seemed, from the audience's perspective, like the absolute minimum that a show claiming to be queer should have been able to do from the start. There was a particular kind of gratitude toward Sugar and the crew for fighting those battles while largely concealing the fight, for protecting the audience from the knowledge of how precarious the representation they had come to love actually was. And for some fans, there was a recalibration of earlier criticisms, a recognition that some of what had felt like the show's failure to fully commit to its own representation might have been shaped by constraints the creators could not speak openly about at the time. But there was also a more complicated emotional response in parts of the fandom, particularly among those who had been most invested in the show's queer representation. Because if the network had been actively restricting how explicit the show's queerness could be, then the representation that fans had found, that had felt like a miracle, was also a compromised version of what the creators had wanted to make. The show had been doing the best it could within limits that were not of its choosing, and the best it could do had still felt like more than anything else on television. But knowing that made the experience of the show slightly different in retrospect, tinged with a particular kind of melancholy. The awareness of what it had not been permitted to be. The miracle was real. It was also partial. And partial miracles are things you can be grateful for and sad about simultaneously. Rebecca Sugar's story of making Steven Universe at Cartoon Network is, in the end, a story about institutional power and creative persistence. About what it takes to move an institution not by confronting it directly, which is almost never effective in the short term, but by working within it, by creating facts on the ground, by advancing incrementally in the direction you need to go until the institution finds itself somewhere it would not have chosen to be if anyone had asked. It is a story about what a queer creator with a queer vision had to do to make a queer show for a network that was not sure it wanted one. The result was something that mattered to a very large number of people in a very real way. The cost was real too. And understanding both the achievement and the cost is necessary for understanding what Steven Universe actually was and what it was actually doing in the years of its existence. Section 7. The hiatus problem. There is a particular kind of anxiety that belongs specifically to being a fan of an ongoing television series in the age of social media. It is the anxiety of waiting, of knowing that a story exists, that it is being made, that the people who make it know what happens next and you do not, and will not, until they choose to release it. This anxiety has existed in some form as long as there have been serialized stories and audiences who wanted the next installment immediately. But social media gave this waiting a new quality, a new acuteness, because it meant you did not wait alone. You waited together with thousands of other people, sharing the waiting, expressing the waiting constantly, watching everyone else's frustration amplify your own. The collective experience of waiting in the age of real-time social media is an intensified version of the individual experience, and the intensification matters. And no show in that era made its audience wait like Steven Universe made them wait. The scheduling of Steven Universe, across the majority of its run, was genuinely unusual by the standards of American children's animation. Most shows on Cartoon Network followed recognizable patterns. A season would air weekly for a number of months, then take a defined break, then return with a date announced in advance. Audiences could orient themselves. They knew when to expect something. The wait had a known endpoint. Steven Universe did not operate this way. The show aired in concentrated bursts that the network marketed as Steven Bombs blocks of 5 episodes, typically airing over consecutive weekdays, presented as event programming. Then the show would stop. Not for a defined and announced hiatus, just stop, with no indication of when it would return, and it would stay stopped for months. The Steven Bomb format generated controversy of its own entirely separate from the duration of the gaps it created. The argument against presenting a serialized story in burst format was simple and difficult to counter. It was not a good way to experience a narrative with the complexity and emotional density that Steven Universe had. The show's mythology was intricate. Its emotional arcs required time to process and absorb. Individual episodes rewarded reflection before the next one arrived. Dropping 5 episodes in 5 days compressed the experience in a way that made it simultaneously overwhelming and unsatisfying. You watched 5 episodes in a single afternoon, felt the rush and the intensity, and then faced weeks or months of silence. The format served the network's interest in generating concentrated attention and rating spikes. It did not serve the audience's interest in having a genuine relationship with the story. The longest single gap in the show's broadcast history ran from May 29 to November 10 of 2017. 164 days, almost 6 months, during which no new episodes aired. The episodes that had preceded this gap had ended on significant unresolved narrative tension, characters in difficult situations, plot lines at points of genuine uncertainty, the audience suspended at a moment of maximum investment. And then the show disappeared for 164 days. The audience waited in a space that felt, to many of the more emotionally invested fans, like being cut off mid-sentence by someone who then simply left the room and did not return for half a year. Ian Jones-Quartey posted something on social media during this period that became one of the most quoted statements in the fandom's history. He acknowledged, in terms that were rueful and clearly not entirely calculated, that being a Steven Universe fan was suffering. The post was later deleted or removed, but by then it had already circulated through the community, had been screenshotted and shared and discussed extensively, had become the kind of ironic but not really catchphrase that emerges in fandoms when a situation is too frustrating to treat entirely seriously. Being a Steven Universe fan was suffering. The creator of the show was acknowledging it. The people who made it were experiencing it alongside the people who watched it. And yet here they all were, and the episodes were not coming. This matters more than it might seem to because the scheduling decisions were made at the network level and not by the show's creative team. This point tends to get lost in discussions of the hiatus problem because the fandom's frustration did not always carefully distinguish between the people responsible for the scheduling and the people responsible for the show's content. Rebecca Sugar and her team could make episodes. They could not make Cartoon Network air those episodes in a rhythm that was good for the audience's experience of them. That was a decision made above them in the institutional hierarchy, based on criteria that had nothing to do with what served the story or the community. The creators were, in important respects, as much at the mercy of the scheduling as the audience was. Understanding this did not make the waiting easier. And the waiting, for a fandom already running at high emotional temperature, already prone to the kind of intense investment that collapses distance between fiction and personal experience, had measurable consequences for the community's behavior and its internal temperature. People talked about the hiatuses in terms that were, by any calm external measure, somewhat disproportionate to a television scheduling situation in terms of abandonment, of grief, of the particular pain of having something you had given yourself to taken away without warning or explanation or any indicated endpoint. These were genuine feelings. They were also responses to a situation that was genuinely bad by the standards of what audiences had reason to expect. During the long gaps, the fandom filled the silence with the only material available to it, itself. Fan content production intensified. Fan theory proliferated at extraordinary rates, elaborate structures of speculation that filled the empty space where new episodes would have been. The community turned its analytical attention inward, examining and re-examining existing material for details that might predict where the story was going, constructing arguments about character arcs and plot developments with a rigor that sometimes rivaled academic analysis. Some of this was wonderful. Some of it was less healthy. The theorizing could become a way of insisting on certainty where none existed, of reducing the pleasure of uncertainty to a problem to be solved through sufficient application of effort. And it created conditions where, when the show returned and did something different from what the most invested theorists had argued, the disappointment was not merely the disappointment of having been wrong, but something that felt more like betrayal. The hiatus problem also fed into the broader critical case against the show's pacing that would eventually become organized as the SU critical movement. The argument ran that the show contained too many episodes that the critics called filler episodes, enjoyable on their own terms but not advancing the central narrative. In a show with consistent weekly airings, This kind of episode has a clear function. It gives the audience room to breathe between major developments, allows characters to exist in lower stake situations, keeps the world of the show present and alive in viewers' lives without requiring constant escalation. But in a show delivered in burst format with long gaps, lighter episodes had a different effect. During a burst, a lighter episode might mean spending one of the 5 available slots on something that did not feel essential, and then the burst would end, and the waiting would begin. And what you had been left with was not a cliff's edge of narrative tension, but something softer and easier to step away from, which paradoxically made the waiting harder, not easier. The pacing critique, in retrospect, was partly inseparable from the scheduling problem. The show had been structured for one mode of delivery and presented to its audience in a fundamentally different mode, and the mismatch produced experiences that were frustrating in ways that were difficult to attribute clearly to either the show or the scheduling in isolation. Critics who argued the show was paced badly were responding to a real experience of watching it. But the experience was shaped by conditions outside the show's control, as much as by creative choices within it. Both things were contributing. Neither was the complete explanation. What the hiatus problem produced, ultimately, was a fandom that felt abandoned by an institution it had given a significant amount of itself to. Not by the show's creators, most fans understood, at least intellectually, that the scheduling was a network decision, but by Cartoon Network, which had attracted this audience's devotion and then managed that devotion with what felt like indifference. The community had built something extraordinary around this show, an entire creative culture, thousands of hours of fan work, genuine relationships formed around shared investment in this story. And the network that distributed that story was managing it in a way that seemed to treat the audience as a resource to be optimized around, rather than a community to be respected. The resentment this produced was real, and it was, in important ways, justified. And it colored the fandom's engagement with everything else. Section 8. The Diamond Redemption Debate. One of the things that made Steven Universe distinctive from other animated series of its era was its sustained and serious commitment to redemption. Not redemption as a narrative shortcut, not the quick pivot of a villain into an ally performed without weight or earned consequence, the kind of turnaround that happens in 20 minutes and requires the audience to simply accept it. The show's treatment of Peridot across multiple seasons of careful development was the fullest expression of what the show actually meant when it gestured toward the possibility of change. Peridot arrived as an antagonist in the precise bureaucratic sense, contemptuous, by the book, entirely convinced of the correctness of the homeworld system that had formed her. Over the course of her arc, she was forced to encounter kindness she had not anticipated, to confront values she had taken for granted, to begin the slow and uncomfortable and occasionally backsliding process of genuinely reconsidering who she was and what she believed. It was developed over a long time. It was given room to breathe and to fail and to recover, and it felt real. It felt like an honest portrait of what change actually looks like when it is actually happening. And then came the Diamonds. And then came Change Your Mind, the 5th season finale. And then came one of the most sustained and serious critical debates the show had ever generated. The Diamonds were the supreme rulers of the homeworld, an empire that had colonized thousands of planets, that had shattered individual gems as punishment for deviation from its norms, that had caused incalculable harm to the populations and ecologies it had moved through. They were the show's ultimate antagonists in every structural and moral sense. Yellow Diamond, voiced by Patti LuPone with extraordinary precision, was introduced first a figure of efficiency and suppressed grief, running the mechanics of conquest with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that feeling is a liability. Blue Diamond, voiced by Lisa Hannigan, was introduced next consumed by mourning for Pink Diamond in ways that had calcified into a permanent state, keeping a zoo of humans as a memorial gesture that was simultaneously tender and deeply wrong. They were compelling antagonists, well-drawn and internally consistent. And then White Diamond arrived. White Diamond had been present in the show's mythology for a long time before she physically appeared referenced in murals, and in the careful way that other gems spoke about Homeworld's authority, present as an absence, a figure so central to everything that her actual appearance had been indefinitely deferred. When she arrived in the 5th season, she was extraordinary. Visually unlike anything else in the show's design language, monochrome, perfectly controlled, drawn with a slightly different quality than other gems that made her feel simultaneously more and less real. Christine Ebersol's voice performance was remarkable, giving her a benevolent certainty that was more frightening than simple malevolence would have been. She was not cruel in the conventional sense. She was something harder to name, a being who had organized her entire existence around the principle that she was right, that her way was the only way, that imperfection in any form was a problem to be corrected, and not a feature of a living world to be accepted. In the finale, Change Your Mind, she was redeemed. Within a single episode, the reaction from a significant portion of the fandom was immediate and genuinely heated. After seasons of building the Diamonds as the most consequential antagonists the show had depicted after Yellow and Blue, had both been given extended arcs that created expectations about how the show would ultimately handle its most significant villains. White Diamond was confronted by Steven, and, over the course of a single episode that was already doing an enormous amount of plot work simultaneously, began to change. The episode was extraordinarily ambitious in scope, resolving multiple major storylines at once, and it was doing all of that while also attempting to do something with White Diamond that the show's treatment of Peridot had taken multiple seasons to accomplish. Critics argued that it did not work. That White Diamond's turn her movement from absolute certainty to something more open, from perfect control to something fractured and beginning to reconsider, was narratively unearned. The show had told its audience, repeatedly and in considerable detail, that White Diamond's control of Homeworld was total, and that her certainty was impenetrable. And then it showed that certainty breaking without adequately establishing why. Steven's appeal to her, a direct emotional argument, characteristic of his approach throughout the series, was genuinely powerful in execution. But it was not, on its own, a sufficient explanation of why it worked on this particular being, when so many other things had presumably failed to reach her across whatever timescale she had existed. The show had taken an emotional shortcut, critics argued, had reached for the feeling of resolution rather than doing the full work of earning it. There were also political criticisms with genuine substance. The Diamonds were colonizers in the most direct possible sense. Their civilization was organized around expanding through the universe by exploiting the resources of other planets and the labor of the gems produced from them. Their redemption, critics noted, was a redemption without any structural consequence. They changed or were depicted as beginning to change, but they did not face any meaningful accountability for what they had done. Homeworld continued to exist organized around structures they had built. The individual gems who had been shattered or corrupted or otherwise harmed under their rule did not receive justice in any form. What the show offered in place of justice was the repentance of the powerful, which is, in the real world as in fiction, frequently insufficient. Frequently a mechanism by which the powerful relieve their own guilt without making anything materially better for the people they harmed. Defenders of the episode and the arc pointed to the show's consistent and clearly articulated thesis, the principle that had defined Steven's approach to conflict from his earliest appearances. Steven Universe was a show that believed in empathy as a genuine transformative force. It believed that beings could change. It believed that the goal of resistance should be not the defeat and destruction of oppressors, but their conversion, their genuine realization of what they had done and their movement towards something better. This is a coherent moral position. It has a long history in ethical and political thought, and in the hands of a show with Steven's emotional intelligence, it is also a powerful narrative position. The show had made this argument successfully with smaller characters throughout its run. The question was whether the argument held when applied to beings of the Diamond scale, whether a philosophy that worked beautifully for Peridot could be credibly extended to beings who had caused harm across a galaxy. Rebecca Sugar has spoken about the White Diamond arc in personal terms, describing it as expressing something about the experience of confronting a figure of absolute authority, of recognizing that such a figure's certainty is a performance, a defense, a form of brittleness rather than genuine strength, and that underneath it is something that can be reached if you find the right approach. On this reading, White Diamond is not primarily a political figure, but a psychological one, a portrait of a certain kind of authority that maintains itself through the elimination of everything it cannot control, and that becomes capable of something different when it encounters someone who refuses to be controlled or eliminated. This reading is available in the text. Whether it is sufficient to address the political implications of the show's choices, whether personal and psychological resonance can substitute for political accountability at the scale the show was operating at, is exactly the question the debate was about, and it remains genuinely open. What the Diamond Redemption debate revealed, more than anything else, was that the show's central thesis, its conviction that love and empathy are the most powerful transformative forces available, was an argument, not an axiom. It was a position the show was making, and like all positions, it was one that could be agreed with or disagreed with after examination. The show had always believed its argument was true. That belief was its most distinctive feature, the thing that made it feel different from other animated series. But when that belief was extended to the scale of the Diamonds, to beings who had functioned as the instruments of civilizational scale harm, the argument was put under more pressure than it had previously been subjected to. And under that pressure, it showed its strain, and the fandom divided along the fault line between those who still believed the argument and those who found, at its moment of fullest expression, that they could not follow it all the way. Section 9 Sue Critical Verses. The Defense Force. By 2016 and 2017, a new kind of organized voice had emerged within the Steven Universe fandom, or perhaps more accurately, a voice that had always existed in smaller and more scattered forms had coalesced into something with enough critical mass to be named. The community that came to be called SU Critical was a loosely affiliated group of fans who believed that the show deserved honest critical engagement rather than pure celebration, who thought that loving something meant being willing to look at it clearly, to acknowledge where it fell short of its own aspirations, to hold it accountable to the standards it had set for itself. They had criticisms of the show's pacing, of its treatment of certain characters, of the ways its visual and narrative choices around race did not always align with its stated progressive commitments, of the gap, which they found significant and worth naming, between what the show was trying to be and what it actually was when examined carefully. In most creative communities, this kind of critical voice would be uncontroversial. The ability to love a piece of work while being honest about its limitations is not a contradiction. It is, in most contexts, simply what it looks like to engage with art seriously. We can find a novel genuinely moving while recognizing that its final chapters lose momentum. We can think a film is important while noting that its treatment of a particular character is underdeveloped or inconsistent. We can be invested in a show's existence and success while being clear-eyed about the choices it makes that do not work as well as other choices might have. Critical engagement with media that matters to you is not a form of betrayal. It is, in many ways, the deepest form of respect, the insistence that the work be held accountable to its own stated intentions. But the Steven Universe fandom was not structured in a way that made space for that kind of engagement. The show's representation had real and personal stakes for a large portion of its audience. When you have found in a piece of media something that feels like recognition of yourself, when the show has given you language for your identity, has confirmed that your particular way of being in the world exists and is worth depicting, criticism of that show can feel, at a visceral level, like criticism of yourself, like a denial of the reality and value of what the show gave you. The people doing the criticizing can feel, regardless of their actual intentions, like enemies of something essential. The SU Defense Force was the name applied, partly from outside and partly with internal irony, to the most vocal defenders of the show against criticism of any kind. At its most extreme, the Defense Force operated on an implicit principle that any criticism of Steven Universe was either misguided in its analysis or actively harmful in its effect, that pointing out the show's failures of execution was functionally an attack on its LGBTQ representation, that engaging with or amplifying critical material was providing assistance to people who wanted the show to fail or to disappear. The argument conflated critique of specific creative choices with opposition to the show's existence, as if there were no meaningful difference between saying this episode's handling of this character felt underdeveloped and saying this show should not be on television. The conflation was not honest, but it was emotionally available to people in a particular kind of pain, and understanding why it was available matters more than simply dismissing it. For someone who was young and queer and had found in this show the first real reflection of themselves in mainstream media, the idea that some people wanted to talk about what the show did wrong could feel genuinely threatening. The representation was fragile in their experience. It had taken so long to arrive. It could be so easily undermined by people who wanted it gone. If you were holding that fear, then critics of the show might look through that lens, like threats even when they were not. The SU critical community was not entirely free of its own excesses, and that too needs to be said. The criticisms of the show's racial coding were sometimes made with a rigidity that foreclosed more nuanced readings. The community could develop the same mob dynamics it criticized in the Defense Force, directing concentrated criticism at fans who expressed affection for the show without adequate critical distance, treating enthusiasm for the work as evidence of naivety or complicity. Some members of SU Critical were thoughtful and precise and engaged with the show seriously. Others used the community's critical framework to perform a different kind of superiority from the defense forces, equally dismissive of anyone who didn't share their conclusions. What developed between the two formations was something like a Cold War with periodic eruptions of active hostility. SU Critical posts would circulate, and people who found them would respond with engagement if they agreed, with counter-mobilization if they felt the criticism was unfair or harmful. The responses generated more responses. A discussion about a specific episode's handling of a specific character would expand, through the amplification mechanisms of the platform, into a general argument about whether the show could be criticized at all, which would expand further into accusations about motives and identities, and whose voice on this topic was legitimate and whose was not. These cycles were exhausting, and they repeated, in various forms, with remarkable regularity, over years. The structural feature that made this dynamic self-sustaining was the architecture of Tumblr itself. The platform's reblogging mechanism meant that content traveled through social networks in ways that were hard to predict and impossible to control. A post intended for a small audience, a personal expression of frustration with a story choice, a careful critique of a specific episode's decisions could find its way through a chain of reblogs to audiences who encountered it entirely without context, who read it through the filters of their own assumptions and investments and fears. And then those audiences would respond, and their responses would travel through their own networks. And the conversation would expand geometrically until it bore almost no relationship to whatever had originally been said. This is not a problem unique to the Steven Universe fandom. It describes how discourse functions on social media in general, across virtually every topic and every community. But the particular intensity of the Steven Universe fandom, the particular degree of personal investment that many of its members brought to it, made the dynamic more acute in this community than in many others. When you believe the show matters to your survival, when your investment in it is connected to your identity in ways that make critique feel threatening, the incentives to engage in escalating conflict, when you feel that investment is threatened, are stronger than they are for most audiences about most shows. There were individual voices who tried to hold a space between the two communities, people who said, plainly and consistently, that loving Steven Universe and having honest criticisms of it were not mutually exclusive positions, that the show's representation was genuinely important, and that the show was also genuinely imperfect, that holding both of those assessments simultaneously was not contradiction, but clear-sightedness. These voices existed, and they produced some of the most thoughtful writing about the show that emerged during this entire period. Long essays, video analyses, conversations that tried to take the show seriously as a piece of art to celebrate what it genuinely achieved while being honest about where it fell short of its ambitions. But these voices were frequently drowned out by the louder and more certain parties on either side. The discourse engine did not reward nuance or care. It rewarded clarity and force, and the kind of certainty that generates strong reactions. And the SU Critical versus Defense Force conflict, whatever else it was a machine that produced strong reactions reliably and continuously, feeding itself on the energy of people who cared deeply and were not managing that caring with enough structure to keep it healthy. By the time the show ended its main run, both communities had burned enormous amounts of energy in conflicts that had not resolved anything. The show had continued to exist and be watched regardless of what either side said. The representation had been real. The flaws had been real. Both communities had been partly right and partly wrong, and partly operating from genuine pain that made it difficult for anyone inside them to see clearly. In the aftermath of the show's conclusion, some of the heat began to dissipate, not completely, not evenly, but somewhat. The way the temperature drops after a storm, when the pressure that built it has finally been released. Section 10. The smaller storms. Not every controversy in the history of the Steven Universe fandom was a defining event. Not everyone sent shockwaves through the community that lasted months. The show's run was also punctuated by smaller incidents, events that were, individually, less significant than what we have been discussing, but that together painted a portrait of a fandom operating at a permanently elevated temperature in which almost any situation could become a flashpoint, with very little provocation. These smaller storms were, in their own way, just as revealing as the larger ones. They showed what the fandom was quick to find threatening, what situations could escalate unexpectedly, and what the cumulative experience of being in this community felt like from the inside during the years of the show's run. The Art and Origins book was published in 2017, a supplementary publication collecting concept art, design notes, and commentary from the show's production history. This is the kind of book that fans of animated series genuinely love a chance to see the working material that underlies the polished final product, to understand how characters and worlds evolved from early ideas into the things that appeared on screen. The book was anticipated with genuine enthusiasm, and then, when copies arrived in fans' hands, something was noticed in the section of staff sketches. A drawing was found that appeared to be a racial caricature imagery using visual shorthand with a specific and painful history in American illustration, associations that were impossible to ignore once the connection was made. The discovery spread through the fandom with the speed that all such discoveries spread through close-knit online communities. Lamar Abrams, a storyboard artist on the show, came forward to acknowledge that the sketch was his. He apologized directly, clearly, without deflection. He said he had not been thinking about the historical associations the image carried, that he was distressed to have caused harm, that he was sorry. Rebecca Sugar also apologized publicly. The publisher replaced the image in subsequent printings of the book. The response from the show's creative team was, as responses to these situations go, about as direct and responsible as such responses can be: immediate acknowledgement, genuine apology, concrete corrective action. It was handled as well as it could be handled. But it left a mark, another data point in the fandom's accumulating record of moments where the gap between the show's aspirations and the reality of its production became visible. Then there was the Make-A-Wish incident, which occupies a category all its own, in terms of the sheer strangeness of what happened and the specific light it cast on how the fandom functioned when collective anger was pointed in a particular direction. A child with cancer had been granted a wish through the Make-A-Wish Foundation and had used that wish to visit the Steven Universe production studio. The visit was arranged. The child met members of the creative team, was given a tour of the production space, was treated with what by all accounts was genuine generosity and warmth. And the child, as children who have been given something extraordinary tend to do, wanted to share the experience, including some details about what they had seen of upcoming episodes, details about story developments that had not yet aired. This information reached the fandom through the channels that information reaches fandoms. A YouTuber who made content about animated series for a substantial audience produced a video in response to the spoilers. In that video, they mocked the child. They mocked a child with cancer for having shared information about a cartoon show with other fans of that cartoon show. The mockery was, by any reasonable standard, wildly disproportionate to whatever violation it was addressing. Spoiler etiquette, if that is even the right frame for what a sick child does after visiting a production studio, is not a moral principle of sufficient weight to justify public mockery of anyone, let alone a child in that situation. The fandom's response was swift and substantially negative, which was the appropriate response to what had happened. The problem was what came next. The child posted an apology. The child, the Make-A-Wish child, the child who had been publicly mocked by an adult, posted an apology to the person who had mocked them. However that outcome was produced, whoever suggested or encouraged or failed to discourage the apology, the fact of it is the most troubling part of the entire story. A child apologizing to the adult who humiliated them is not an accountability outcome. It is an inversion of accountability. And the fandom, which had responded with appropriate anger to the original video, did not produce conditions that prevented this outcome. The YouTuber eventually apologized. Approximately a year later, the apology was accepted in the relevant quarters. The incident faded into the larger history of the fandom. but it raised questions that stayed in the background of subsequent discussions about the community's approach to accountability and conflict questions about what happens when the machinery of collective anger, however justifiably activated, runs without adequate consideration of the human beings it is affecting. The anger at the video was correct. The outcome it produced was not something anyone had intended or wanted. Both things can be true simultaneously, and the distance between correct anger and good outcomes can be very large when the systems mediating that anger are not designed with care. The promotional spoiler problem was its own persistent category of frustration, separate from but connected to all of the above. Throughout the show's run, various promotional materials, network trailers, press materials, interview reveals, convention panel disclosures would sometimes release information about story developments before those developments aired, in ways the fandom had not been warned to expect and was not uniformly able to avoid. A promotional clip would appear online revealing a character whose appearance in the story was supposed to be a surprise. An interviewer would ask a creator about a plot point that viewers had not yet reached. The information would propagate through the fandom with immediate and unstoppable velocity, dividing the community into those who had seen it and those who had been attempting to avoid it and had just failed. In most fandoms, promotional spoilers are an irritant and a topic of discussion. In the Steven Universe fandom, they generated outrage reliably and consistently, partly because the community was already operating at a heightened emotional baseline, and partly because the show's storytelling genuinely relied on certain surprises and reveals landing with full force, and advanced knowledge of them did meaningfully affect the viewing experience. The frustration was not unreasonable. The intensity with which it was expressed was, again, somewhat disproportionate, but the disproportion is the recurring feature of this community's responses to frustration, not an anomaly. Taken individually, none of these smaller incidents rises to the level of significance that the incidents in earlier sections of this story do. But taken together, they sketch something important. They show a community that was, by the middle years of the show's run, in a state of more or less permanent low-grade agitation, not erupting constantly into major conflicts, but never entirely at rest either. The big controversies were the peaks of something that was always elevated. The smaller incidents were the texture of daily life in the fandom, constant, varied, collectively exhausting, and revealing in ways that any individual incident was not. They also cluster, when you look at them together, around the same recurring themes that animate the larger controversies: representation and the gap between aspiration and execution, accountability and the ways that collective anger can produce outcomes no one individually wanted, the relationship between the show and the institution that distributed it, and the ways that institutional decisions shaped the audience's experience in ways the creators could not fully control. These are not separate issues that happen to generate controversy in the same fandom at the same time. They are expressions of the same underlying tensions, playing out at different scales, in different contexts, with different specific people involved but with the same fundamental dynamics at work. Section 11: Steven Universe Future. The ending that divided everyone. When Steven Universe concluded its main 5-season run with the finale in January 2019, there was a widespread sense within the fandom that the story was, in most of the important ways, complete. The major questions had been answered. The antagonists had been confronted. The show had arrived at a conclusion that felt, to most viewers, like a genuine conclusion, not a pause or a setup, but an actual arrival. Steven was going home. The gems were going to be okay. The world was healed, or healed enough. It was a good ending. It felt like the show had said what it wanted to say. And then Cartoon Network announced Steven Universe Future. The limited series continuation was announced for late 2019, with 20 episodes planned, airing over a period that would run into early 2020. Rebecca Sugar has described it in various interviews as something like a coda or an extended epilogue, an opportunity the success of the main series had earned her to explore a question that most fantasy and adventure narratives do not ask: the question of aftermath. What happens to the hero after the heroic part is over? What does it cost, psychologically and emotionally, to have been the person Steven had been trained to be from birth? What does someone who has spent their entire existence being the one who holds everything together actually look like when the thing that needed holding together has been, more or less, held? These were genuine questions. They were also unusual questions for a children's animated series to pursue, and the willingness to pursue them in a limited series format, rather than simply leaving the feel-good ending to stand on its own, was a creative decision that required both courage and a clear sense of purpose. Rebecca Sugar knew what she wanted Future to be about, and what she wanted it to be about was genuinely difficult material. Steven in Future was not okay. This became clear gradually, and then more rapidly over the course of the 20 episodes. He was struggling with something that the show had been building toward, without always naming directly the accumulated weight of everything he had absorbed and managed and resolved and taken responsibility for. The years of being the person who absorbed other people's pain, who filled in for other people's needs, who made everything better without anyone consistently asking whether he was okay in return. He was dealing with what the show eventually named explicitly as something resembling post-traumatic stress, with unprocessed grief. With anger at his mother for the situation she had left him in, anger at the people who had needed so much from him for so long without really seeing what it was costing, anger at himself for the ways he had managed his pain by suppressing it rather than feeling it. He had never been asked, in any genuine sustained way, whether he was okay, and he was not okay. The show depicted this with a specificity and care that was genuinely unusual in children's animation. Steven's powers became unstable, responding to his emotional state in ways he could not control, spiking when he was stressed or frightened or angry, in ways that externalized his psychological state as a visual phenomenon. The pink energy that was Rose's power, and his power manifested as something uncontrolled and frightening, something that threatened the people around him rather than protecting them. This was a deliberate and effective metaphor. The thing that was supposed to be his gift had become a symptom of everything he had not dealt with. He saw a therapist. This deserves to be named plainly because it mattered. A children's animated series depicted its protagonist going to therapy, finding a human mental health professional, talking to her about his feelings and his history and the ways his life had shaped him. The therapist did not fully understand the specifics of his situation. She was a human woman who could not be expected to know the details of gem civilization and the particular forms of harm Steven had encountered. But she understood grief and suppression and the particular damage done to people who have been trained to be caretakers without being cared for, and she helped Steven find his way towards something he had not been able to find on his own. He named his anger. He said out loud that he was angry at his mother for what she had left him with. This was one of the quietest and most significant moments in the entire run of the show. And the fandom met Future with a divided response that was, by this point in the show's history, almost entirely predictable in its structure, if not in its specific shape. Some viewers found Future to be the most emotionally honest and courageous thing the show had ever done. A brave and necessary exploration of costs that adventure narratives almost never examine the real psychological price of being the hero, the specific damage done to people who are trained from childhood to prioritize others' needs over their own, the thing that happens when the adventure ends and the person who was the hero has to figure out how to be a person. For these viewers, Future was the show fully committing to its most important argument, not the argument about empathy as a force of transformation, which the main series had made extensively, but the argument that the people who do the empathizing also deserve to be seen and cared for. That the person who heals everyone else also needs to be healed. Other viewers were uncomfortable with Future in ways they found difficult to articulate cleanly. Not because the themes were wrong to explore, but because the execution sometimes felt rushed or compressed in ways that made Steven's experience harder to follow and harder to fully feel. The 20-episode format, it emerged, was shorter than the series Sugar had originally envisioned. Circumstances required compression, and the compression was sometimes visible in the pacing of individual character arcs and in the way that certain storylines resolved faster than their emotional weight warranted. The series was doing ambitious things within constraints that limited how fully those ambitions could be realized. There were also viewers who had expected something different from a continuation, who had come in hoping for more of the world-building and mythological exploration that had been one of the main series' great pleasures. More stories about specific characters whose arcs felt unfinished, more of the kind of adventure and discovery that had drawn them to the show in the first place. What they got was something substantially more interior, more focused on Steven's psychological state, more explicitly about the specific experience of someone who has spent their entire life as a caretaker. For those viewers, Future was a disappointment not because it was bad, but because it was not the thing they had wanted. The portrayal of Steven himself in Future was a source of specific debate. Steven in these episodes made bad decisions. He hurt people he cared about. He behaved in ways that were selfish or reactive or simply wrong in the moment. He was, in other words, a person under genuine psychological stress behaving the way people under such stress often behave imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes hurtfully. The show was not asking the audience to approve of his behavior. It was asking the audience to understand it as arising from a specific history, to hold both what he did and why he did it in the same frame simultaneously. This is a sophisticated ask. Most viewers were able to meet it. Some found it genuinely difficult, and some confusion about whether the show was endorsing Steven's difficult behavior rather than depicting and examining it created real tensions in how the series was received. The finale of Future aired on the 27th of March, 2020. This timing matters. The world was, at that moment, in the early and particularly disorienting days of the COVID-19 pandemic, with much of the global population entering lockdown conditions for the first time, sitting with uncertainty and grief and a suddenly very changed relationship with the world outside their windows. People watched the finale in that context, in a state of heightened emotional sensitivity, and the experience of watching it was colored by everything else that was happening in that very specific moment. The finale depicted Steven reaching a genuine breakthrough, naming everything he had been carrying, allowing himself to feel it fully rather than managing it away, receiving the care of the people who loved him, without immediately redirecting that care towards someone else. And then it depicted him driving away from Beach City in a van with Connie beside him, leaving his home and his family and the place where everything had happened, giving himself the gift of unknown space in which to figure out who he was when he was not performing a role. It was an ending of beginning rather than of arrival, a protagonist not saved but simply ready to try to find himself. The response was genuinely and persistently divided, in ways that the previous season's controversies had not quite prepared people for. Some found it perfect, exactly the right note on which to close, a story that had always been about the costs of becoming the person other people need you to be. Others found it unexpectedly hard to sit with, sad in a way that was difficult to describe, not the warm and affirming conclusion they had associated with the show's emotional tone. Others had specific criticisms of how secondary characters had been handled, felt that the final episode did not adequately honor certain relationships or close certain arcs with sufficient care. What Future added to the Steven Universe story, when viewed as a whole, was something that required a particular willingness to accept discomfort. It followed its protagonist into the aftermath and refused to make the aftermath feel easy. It insisted that happily ever after is not a state that arrives and stays, that the end of the adventure does not automatically constitute the end of the difficulty. It said, in the clearest terms it could find, that the work of being a person does not end. And that argument, however imperfectly executed in some of its individual moments, was real and valuable, and said something worth saying to the audience that had grown up alongside this show. Section 12: What it all meant. There is a particular question that hangs over the whole story we have been telling tonight, a question that does not have a clean answer but that feels important to ask as we approach the end of this long journey together. Was it worth it? Not the show. The show was worth it, clearly. Whatever its imperfections, whatever the debates about its choices, a show that wins a GLAAD Media Award and a Peabody Award, that places on the BBC's list of the greatest television series of the 21st century, that is remembered and discussed and analyzed with genuine seriousness years after its final episode. That show was worth making. But the fandom that formed around it, with all of its intensity and creativity and beauty and ugliness, was the full experience of being in that community, taken whole, worth what it cost. Let us take stock as carefully as we can. The Steven Universe fandom at its best was one of the most creative communities in the history of fan culture. The volume and quality of fan art it produced across the years of the show's run was extraordinary by any measure. The depth of its engagement with the show's mythology and themes, the genuine seriousness with which it treated a piece of children's animation as worthy of careful, close reading and analysis, was something that should be remembered alongside the uglier parts of this history. The conversations the community had about representation, about queer identity in media, about body image, about the ways that even shows with progressive intentions can reproduce problematic patterns in their visual language and narrative choices, these conversations were, in their best moments, genuinely valuable. They were conversations that needed to be had, and in many cases the fandom was having them before they appeared in more mainstream critical discourse. The fandom also produced, at its worst, a situation in which a teenager was hospitalized following a suicide attempt that was directly connected to what the community had done to her. That fact belongs in this accounting alongside everything else, and it belongs without softening. Both things are true. The creativity was real. The harm was real. They came from the same community, from the same intensity, from the same depth of investment that made the community what it was. The question of why the Steven Universe fandom developed the specific pathologies it developed has been analyzed over the years since, in academic writing, in journalism, in video essays, in the kind of retrospective examination that communities generate about themselves when enough time has passed to allow for some perspective. The explanations that emerge consistently are not complicated, but they matter. The fandom was large, and it was young, and it was emotionally invested in ways that were connected to identity and survival, in ways that most fan communities are not. The platform it primarily inhabited had structural features that amplified conflict and rewarded outrage. The show's own values gave the community a moral framework that could be used constructively or weaponized, and that got weaponized. And the show existed in a cultural moment, the middle 2010s, in which the dynamics of online social discourse were being worked out in real time by a generation that had grown up with the internet but was still learning what the internet was capable of doing to the communities formed within it. None of these explanations excuse what happened to specific people during the years of the show's run, but they do help us understand it as something larger than a failure specific to this particular community. They help us see it as the expression of something more general, as a story about what online communities can become when their intensity is not matched by structures that protect individual people from collective pressure. The Steven Universe fandom was not uniquely bad. It was, in many ways, uniquely visible, a large, creative, extensively documented community whose conflicts attracted attention and whose internal dynamics were observed closely enough to be analyzed. The patterns it exhibited existed, in varying forms, in many other fan communities of the same era. It happened that this particular one made those patterns very legible. What the show itself thought about all of this is, in a way, written into the show itself, though perhaps not entirely intentionally. Steven Universe was, from beginning to end, a story about the costs of excessive self-sacrifice, about what happens when you make yourself so fully available to other people's needs that you lose access to your own. About the difference between genuine empathy, which requires the person extending it to remain a full subject with their own needs and limits, and the kind of compulsive caretaking that looks like empathy from the outside but is actually a way of avoiding the difficulty of your own interior life. The show made this argument about Steven, but it was also, perhaps without fully intending to, making it about its own fandom. The community that loved the show so hard that it sometimes hurt people was, in a very real sense, doing what Steven did in Future, extending so much of itself toward the thing it loved that it lost track of its own limits, lost the ability to clearly separate its feelings from its actions, caused harm in the name of love. Steven Universe Future, seen in this light, looks like something more than a coda. It looks like a conversation the show was attempting to have with the community that had formed around it. Here is what happens when you give everything without limit. Here is what the aftermath of that giving looks like. Here is what the actual work of getting better requires, not heroism, not the performance of goodness and correctness, but something slower and harder and more personal. The work of recognizing what you are carrying, the work of letting yourself need things, the work of being, imperfectly and honestly, a person who has needs of their own. The legacy of Steven Universe, as we sit with it now, is a complicated one, which is to say, it is the legacy of something that mattered. Simple things do not generate complicated legacies. The show broke ground that remains broken. It changed what was possible for queer representation in children's animation in ways that have been built upon by the shows that came after it. She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, The Owl House, Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts, the Adventure Time continuations, these shows exist in a landscape that Steven Universe helped to create, a landscape in which what Sugar and her team managed to get on screen helped establish what the next generation of creators could fight for. The arguments the show made about love and identity and the importance of being seen and the possibility of genuine change were heard by the people who needed to hear them. Those people carried those arguments with them into their lives. That is real. That is not diminished by the fandom's failures or the show's imperfections. And the fandom's failures are also, in their way, part of the legacy. Not a legacy anyone would choose, but a real one, because they taught people things that needed to be learned. People who were inside the worst moments of the community, people who participated in behavior they later came to regret, people who watched the behavior happen and stayed silent when they might have spoken, some of them came out the other side with a clearer understanding of what online communities are capable of the ways that good intentions can produce harmful outcomes, of the importance of protecting individual human beings from collective pressure, even when that collective is acting in the name of values it genuinely holds. That understanding is part of the story. It may, in the long run, be one of the more important parts. What the show gave, in the end, was this: a world that was large enough to matter, characters complex enough to care about, a story told with enough sincerity that it reached people who needed reaching, a community that formed around it and did things together that were extraordinary and things together that were not, a creator who fought, within the constraints of an institution that was not always on her side, to put something real into the world, and a boy on a beach, with his mother's gem in his belly, learning slowly and imperfectly, and with many setbacks, how to love people without losing himself in the process. That story is still there, whenever you want to go back to it. 5 seasons, a film, a limited series, more hours of content than most people have fully processed, songs that are still playing in people's heads years later, a world that continues to be drawn and written and reimagined by people who are not done with it yet. Steven Universe is still there, and the argument it made that love is possible, that change is possible, that the past does not have to determine the future, that even the things and people that have caused enormous harm can, under the right conditions, become something different. That argument is still being made by the people the show reached, in the lives they are living. And if this has been a good use of a quiet night, if you have found something in this long telling that felt worth sitting with, we are glad you were here for it. Drop a like if you want. Leave a comment about which part of this story surprised you most, or stayed with you, or made you want to go back and watch something again. Subscribe if you want more of this long, careful, unhurried dives into the stories behind the stories. We will see you in the next one. Sleep well. The night is quiet. The Crystal Temple is lit against the dark, and somewhere Steven is still driving. Section 13, the music and what it did to people. There is a kind of song that operates differently from other songs. It does not announce itself as significant. It does not arrive with swelling orchestra or a key change designed to signal that you are supposed to be moved right now. It just begins, and you listen, and somewhere in the middle of it something shifts in you that you did not entirely plan for. The songs of Steven Universe were consistently and across the entire run of the show that kind of song. And they were a substantial part of why the fandom was the way it was, why people's investment ran so deep, why the show got under people's skin in a way that most animated series do not. The music was not decoration. It was architecture. It was load-bearing. Rebecca Sugar began her career writing songs for Adventure Time, and she brought to Steven Universe a sensibility shaped by that experience, a belief that a song and a piece of animation should not be a pause in the storytelling, but an acceleration of it. A moment when the emotional logic of the scene moves faster than dialogue can keep up with, and the only adequate vehicle is music. This is a classical theatrical principle, the principle that underlies the great tradition of the American musical, and Sugar applied it with remarkable consistency and skill. In Steven Universe, a song arrives when words alone have become insufficient. When a character is feeling something that their verbal expression cannot reach, when the truth of a moment is too dense or too tender or too complicated to be rendered in the flat register of ordinary speech, the result is a body of music that functions, across 5 seasons and a film and a limited series, as something like an emotional archaeology of the show. Layer after layer of feeling, built up over years, accessible to anyone who wants to dig in. And the fandom dug in. The fan communities around the show's music were among the most active and passionate within the larger fandom. People analyzed the songs the way people analyze poems. Close reading of lyric choices, attention to melodic structure, observation of how a song changed from its first appearance to its later reprises, tracking of the motifs that recurred across episodes and what those recurrences said about the emotional connections the show was drawing. Consider what the songs achieved at their best. It's Over, Isn't It? Is Pearl in Season 3, processing the reality of what Rose's relationship with Greg meant for her own relationship with Rose, the particular and devastating specific pain of being someone who was loved immensely, devotedly, without reservation, and still not being the person they chose. It is one of the finest pieces of writing in the show, and it communicates more about Pearl's interior life, more precisely and with more emotional force, in 3 minutes than several full episodes of dialogue managed. You come out of it understanding Pearl in a way you did not going in. Not because she told you anything directly, she did not. But because the song found the shape of what she carried and let you feel it. Here Comes a Thought is Garnet singing with Steven and Connie about anxiety, about intrusive thoughts, about the way worries spiral and accumulate and become overwhelming. It is also, if you are paying attention to what the show has told you about who Garnet is and how she experiences the world, a song about what it means to be a fusion, to be made of two different beings whose perspectives and fears do not always align, and to have to continuously, actively integrate them into a single coherent self. The song is gentle. It is about feelings. It is also, underneath that gentleness, about something quite specific and quite deep in the show's mythology. Escapism, from the movie, is Steven projecting his consciousness into a watermelon version of himself somewhere in the middle of a distant ocean, alone, trying to find his way back to the people he loves. It is one of the loneliest songs in the entire show, and it functions as a map of Steven's emotional state at that moment. Far from everyone, doing something that no one else can do or fully understand, not certain he knows the way home. The smallness of the situation, a boy who can travel across the planet in someone else's body, looking up at the sky from the inside of a watermelon, is somehow what makes the loneliness feel real. Change Your Mind, the song that ends the Season 5 arc, is both a direct address from Steven to White Diamond and a thesis statement for what the show believes more broadly. You do not have to be what the people and systems that shaped you decided you would be. You are allowed to become something different. The past does not have to determine the future. Change is possible. The song does not answer the show's cosmological questions. It does not explain where the diamonds came from or what the gem civilization was for. It just insists, with building conviction, that it is possible to change, that the people who caused harm can become people who do not cause harm. That identity is not fixed, that whoever you were built to be, you can become someone else. This is the show's answer, expressed in music, to most of the hard questions the fandom debated. Not an explanation, but an insistence. Not here is why things are the way they are, but here is why they do not have to stay that way. And the reason the fandom responded to the music the way it did, the reason songs from Steven Universe circulated on social media years after they first aired, the reason people quoted them in discussions of entirely non-cartoon topics, the reason they continue to be covered and arranged and referenced in ways that suggest genuine longevity is that the music managed to do something the show's more explicit narrative sometimes struggled to do. It made the argument feel true. Not reasoned through, not demonstrated, but felt. And feelings, as the show itself believed, are how transformation actually begins. The fandom argument about the show's music was, notably, one of the less contentious areas of debate. There was disagreement about plenty of things, but the quality of the music was something close to consensus. Even people who had serious criticisms of the show's narrative choices, even members of the SU critical community, tended to acknowledge that the songs were remarkable. This near consensus itself says something. It suggests that the music was doing something that the rest of the show's elements were doing inconsistently, that it was the place where the show's ambitions and its execution aligned most reliably. Rebecca Sugar's gift for writing songs that live in the unresolved space, that inhabit emotional territory without trying to explain it away, was the show's most consistently successful element. And it was part of why the show's losses landed as hard as they did in the fandom, because the music had made people feel something real, and real feelings, when they get attached to a fictional world, produce the kind of attachment that is slow and difficult to release. What's the use of feeling blue? Yellow Diamond's song in the Human Zoo episode is worth lingering on specifically because of what it does beneath its surface argument. Yellow is telling Blue to stop mourning Pink, to get back to the business of running an empire, to treat grief as an inefficiency and eliminate it. She makes the case with considerable force and logical clarity. And even as she is making that case, the song is full of feeling. Yellow is grieving Pink too. She is managing her own grief by insisting that grief is a waste of time, by channeling it into work, by demanding that Blue do the same. The irony is not hidden, it is the entire point. The show gives you Yellow Diamond's emotional truth, not through her admission of it, but through the gap between what she says and what you can hear underneath it. This is sophisticated emotional writing, and it is characteristic of what the show does at its best. It trusts the audience to notice the gap. It does not explain the irony. It just presents it and lets it sit there. And the fandom, which had been trained by years of close engagement with the show to pay attention to exactly these kinds of gaps, noticed and felt it and talked about it. The music was the place where the show's intelligence and its emotional honesty most reliably met. And whatever else may be said about the fandom's complicated history with the show, the relationship between that fandom and that music was, consistently, the cleanest and least complicated part of the whole story. Section 14, the show's visual language and why it made people pay attention. One of the things that made Steven Universe unusual as a piece of animation, and that as a side effect, made the fandom unusually attentive and analytically oriented, was the show's commitment to using visual language as a storytelling tool with the same seriousness it brought to narrative and music. The show did not trust only its scripts and its songs to communicate what it needed to communicate. It embedded information in its backgrounds, in its color choices, in the way characters were framed relative to each other, in the evolution of visual details across episodes and seasons. It trained its audience over time to watch carefully, and a fandom trained to watch carefully will find things that other fandoms miss. It will also occasionally find things that were not intended to be found, and treat them as significant. Both of these things happened. The color system is the most discussed and probably the most intentional of the show's visual storytelling strategies. The show used color not just decoratively but informatively. Different locations had distinct color palettes that communicated something about the emotional and thematic character of those locations. Earth scenes were warm, saturated, slightly imprecise, the colors bleeding into each other the way the colors of a lived-in place do. Homeworld scenes were cooler, sharper, more controlled, the palette doing for the setting what the homeworld's ideology did for its residents, reducing complexity to order, enforcing clarity at the expense of warmth. The Crystal Temple was warm and slightly chaotic, the visual expression of a home that had grown around the people living in it over a very long time. Characters' color palettes shifted with their emotional states and their arcs. Pearl's color scheme at the beginning of the series was cooler than it became as she found her way through her grief. Steven's pink energy was, from the beginning, a different shade from Rose's, a detail that became significant when Future explored what the differences between Steven and Rose actually meant in terms of the power they carried. These were not accidents. The show's art team was working with a deliberately constructed color system, and the fandom's careful attention to that system produced observations that the show's creators later confirmed were intentional. The fan community was reading the visual language correctly. It was a language the show had actually built and was using with intention. White Diamond's introduction is perhaps the most visually striking use of this system in the entire show. Her appearance is almost entirely monochromatic. She exists in a visual space that has been drained of the color and warmth that characterize the show's other environments and characters. When Steven ultimately reaches her, when the confrontation in Change Your Mind arrives at its emotional peak, the moment that signals her opening to change is a color one. She blushes. For the first time, pink suffuses her. The color that has, throughout the show, been associated with love and warmth, and the particular legacy of rose quartz and pink diamond appears in White Diamond's face. It is a visual moment before it is a narrative one. You see her change before you hear it articulated. The show trusted that you had been paying attention to the color language long enough to read that moment without explanation. The background art in the show was another place where intentional storytelling was embedded in ways that rewarded close attention. The show's background artists were, under the art direction established by Rebecca Sugar and her team, building a world with a specific history visible in its physical environment. The Crystal Temple showed its age and the ways it had been modified by the people living in it. Beach City's architecture suggested a specific kind of American coastal town with a specific economic history. The kindergartens on Earth showed, in their visual degradation, the long-term environmental cost of the gem colonization process. The backgrounds were not generic settings. They were part of the argument the show was making about what this world was and what had happened in it. The fandom cataloged all of this. Fan wikis grew enormous with detailed documentation of visual continuity and visual symbolism across the show's seasons. Fan artists produced elaborate analyses of specific episodes' visual choices. Convention panels included presentations on the show's art direction. This level of engagement produced a relationship between the show and its audience that was unusually participatory. The audience was not passively receiving the story but actively co-constructing it, filling in implications, tracing connections, building a more complete picture of the world than any single episode provided. This participatory relationship had, as we have established, its difficult dimensions. The close attention that allowed people to notice and appreciate the show's intentional visual storytelling also allowed them to notice and react to things that were not intentional, to treat inconsistencies as deliberate signals, to build theories on foundations that were shaky in ways that became clear only when the show went somewhere those theories had not predicted. The investment in theory and analysis created conditions for a particular kind of disappointment when the show did not go where the analysis had suggested it would, a disappointment that felt, to people who had done the analytical work, like a specific kind of betrayal, rather than the ordinary unpredictability of a serialized narrative. But the visual richness of the show was also simply a gift. It was one of the things that made rewatching it rewarding in ways that first viewings could not entirely be. Things that seemed like background details on first encounter became legible as plot elements on second. Character expressions that had seemed ambiguous became precise when you understood more about what the character was going through. The show built in ways that rewarded the investment of attention over time, and that investment made by hundreds of thousands of people across the years of the show's run produced a relationship between the fandom and the work that was genuinely unusual in the history of children's animation. It was a fandom that had done its homework, that had taken the show's visual ambition seriously enough to try to read it fluently. And the show, for its part, had built a visual language worth learning. Section 15. The World of Beach, City and the Humans the Show Loved. There is a tendency, when discussing Steven Universe and everything that happened around it, to focus almost entirely on the gems, on the mythology, the cosmic scale, the ancient history, the politics of the homeworld in the crystal gems and the war and its aftermath. And this focus is understandable, because those elements are where the show's most ambitious storytelling lived. But doing so risks overlooking something that was, in quieter ways, equally central to what the show was doing: the human world. The small American beach town that served as the show's home base. The ordinary people who lived there, who had been living next to an alien magical temple for their entire lives, who navigated that proximity with varying degrees of awareness and comfort and willful obliviousness. Beach City was not just a setting. It was an argument about what kind of world the show believed it lived in, and about the relationship between the extraordinary and the everyday. Beach City is a small coastal settlement on what appears to be the eastern seaboard of the United States, the kind of place that exists in pockets along that coastline, built around a boardwalk and a combination of seasonal tourism and year-round working-class community that gives it a particular economic and social character. It has a fry shop called Fish Stew Pizza, which is the kind of name a place gets when it has been there long enough that the original owner's bad idea for branding has become part of the local texture. It has a big donut, which is staffed by teenagers in the way that such places always are. It has a mechanic and a farmer and a woman who runs an art gallery and a mayor who is making the best of an unusual situation. It has a lighthouse and a beach and a resident conspiracy theorist who has been cataloging evidence of paranormal activity for years and is, it turns out, more or less completely correct about everything he suspects. That conspiracy theorist is Ronaldo Fryman, the teenage son of the Fish Stew Pizza family, and he is one of the show's most interesting background characters precisely because of his position relative to the information the audience has. Ronaldo runs a blog called Keep Beach City Weird. He collects evidence, he theorizes. His frameworks are wrong. He is working without sufficient information, reaching for explanations that fit the evidence he has but that miss the actual shape of what is happening. And yet he is not wrong about the fundamental fact. Strange things are happening in Beach City. Alien beings of extraordinary power live there. Events occur that do not occur elsewhere. Ronaldo is right, and nobody tells him so, and the show never quite decides whether the failure to tell him is because the Crystal Gems and Steven believe the truth would be too much for him, or because they simply do not think he deserves to know, or because telling him would require conversations nobody wants to have. All three of those possibilities are somewhat uncomfortable in different ways, and the show is content to leave all three open. The broader Beach City population's relationship with the Crystal Gem's existence is one of the show's quieter running preoccupations. How much do the people who live there actually know? What have they concluded from decades or generations of proximity to beings who are clearly not human, events that are clearly not ordinary, structures attached to their beach that are clearly not of terrestrial origin? The show's answer appears to be somewhere between more than they let on and less than they probably should, depending on the individual. Mr. Fryman, who runs the pizza place and has watched his son obsess over local anomalies for years, clearly knows something is different about his son's friend Steven and the beings Steven lives with. He has served them food for years. He has watched strange lights over the beach. He has probably noticed that the women from the temple do not age and do not seem to eat and occasionally levitate. Whether he has decided not to ask, or whether he has constructed some sufficient explanation for his own peace of mind that allows him to simply not think about it, is never specified. Mayor Dewey, for most of the series, represents a particular relationship with the Crystal Gems that is worth naming carefully. The relationship of the person who benefits from a protective arrangement and has made a private decision not to ask questions that might complicate it. He is aware on some level that the Crystal Gems protect Beach City. He has been willing to benefit from that protection. He is correspondingly unwilling to pursue any line of inquiry that might require him to understand what he is dealing with in any real depth. When homeworld ships appear over Beach City in later seasons, Mayor Dewey's response is to drive away in a municipal van while a recorded message tells his constituents to take care of themselves. He is not a heroic figure. He is a human figure, which in this show means someone navigating the gap between what he knows and what he would prefer not to know, doing his best with imperfect information and considerable motivated reasoning. Connie is the show's answer to the question of what a human looks like when they fully engage with the reality of what Steven's life involves. Her arc over the series is one of the most quietly satisfying in the show. She goes from Steven's friend who does not know about any of this to a skilled fighter and a full participant in the Crystal Gems' work to a person, with her own plans and her own future, that intersects with, but is not defined by her relationship with Steven or the Gems. Her parents, Dr. and Mr. Maheswaran, have to navigate their daughter's growing involvement in something they do not fully understand and cannot fully protect her from. The show addresses this in a specific episode, Nightmare Hospital, that handles the Maheswaran family's reckoning with Connie's life with considerable care. It is one of the show's better examples of taking its human characters seriously, of treating their concerns and perspectives as worthy of the same narrative attention it gives to the Gems. But the broader population of Beach City never gets that reckoning. The show's humans, outside of specific focused episodes, tend to function as a kind of collective background witnesses to extraordinary events, who normalize those events with a speed and ease that the show uses partly for gentle comedy, but that also, if you look at it from certain angles, represents something worth examining. A community that has been adjacent to an alien war and its ongoing aftermath for generations, that has watched beings of extraordinary power live among them and protect them, that has witnessed events that violate all conventional understanding of what is possible, and that has responded by continuing to run the pizza place and mow the lawn and go about its business. There is something both funny and a little unsettling about that, something that functions as a mirror for the way human beings in general manage proximity to things they cannot fully process. By keeping the ordinary ordinary, by maintaining the texture of daily life, by choosing not to look directly at what looking directly might require. The question of what Beach City looks like a generation after the show ends, after Steven has left, after the Crystal Gems have established whatever relationship with the wider world the show's ending implies is coming, is one that the show leaves open in a way that feels genuinely appropriate. The world is changing around Beach City. What was once a local anomaly is becoming something larger, part of a changed relationship between Earth and the Gem civilization. Whether Beach City becomes a significant node in that changed relationship, a place people come specifically because of its history, or whether it simply continues to be the slightly unusual seaside town it has always been, with the magical temple at one end of the beach and the lighthouse at the other, and the big donut in between, is something we do not know. The show trusts that Beach City will endure. It does not tell us what that endurance looks like. And in that silence, it gives the audience one more open space to imagine into, one more corner of the world to wonder about in a quiet moment. Section 16. The question of Rose Quartz. Rose Quartz is the most discussed character in the Steven Universe fandom. She died before the show began. Everything the audience knows about her comes through the testimony of other people, through their memories, their grief, their loyalty, their anger, their love. She never defends herself. She never explains herself. She is present across 5 seasons of television entirely as an absence, as the shape left in other people's lives by someone who is no longer there to fill it. And the picture of her that emerges from all of this testimony is one of the most genuinely complicated portraits of a person that children's animation has ever attempted. What the show presents as Rose's goodness is real and should be named clearly. She saw beauty in things that other beings regarded as obstacles to be cleared away. She loved the organic life of Earth, humans, and animals, and the tiny, unremarkable things that fill the world between the remarkable ones with a depth that was unusual for a being whose civilization had been treating organic life as a resource to be extracted and discarded for millennia. She started a rebellion to protect a planet she was not obligated to care about, at cost to herself that was genuinely significant. She accepted Garnet's existence as a fusion when Homeworld would have required her destruction, at a moment when that acceptance had real and immediate consequences. She gave Steven love before she even knew him, in the form of a video recording made for a person she would never meet. She gave Greg Universe what sounds, from everything the show shows us about their relationship, like genuine joy. And what the show presents as Rose's harm is also real and also should be named clearly, with the same directness. She hid her real identity, her existence as Pink Diamond, from everyone except Pearl, and she compelled Pearl, through a direct order given with the authority of a diamond, to keep that secret. Pearl was literally unable to tell the truth about what had happened with Pink Diamond's apparent shattering, even in moments across thousands of years where telling the truth might have helped enormously. The compulsion caused Pearl visible psychological distress across the entire series, a distress that the show makes clear was ongoing, and had lasting effects on Pearl's sense of self and her relationship with language and honesty. Rose gave Pearl that burden and then stopped existing. The burden remained. She hid Bismuth away and lied to the Crystal Gems about what had happened to her. She told her closest companions that Bismuth had gone missing in battle. What had actually happened was that she and Bismuth had had a genuine philosophical and strategic disagreement, and Rose had ended the disagreement by defeating Bismuth in a fight and sealing her in a bubble and filing the whole situation under things she preferred not to deal with. Bismuth was in that bubble for thousands of years. Her companions believed she was gone. Rose carried the knowledge of where she actually was and chose, repeatedly, not to revisit the decision. She abandoned Spinel. The full weight of that particular action is something the film Steven Universe, the movie, handles with real force. 6,000 years is not a long time to a diamond, in the same way that a year is not a long time to an adult. But the comparison breaks down because Spinel experienced every one of those 6,000 years consciously, standing in the same spot where Rose had left her, waiting for Rose to come back. The show makes clear that Pink Diamond's reasons for not returning were connected to her growing immersion in her life as Rose Quartz, in the rebellion, in the wonder of Earth, and everything it offered. But the fact of what was left behind a being whose entire identity was built around the relationship she had with Pink Diamond, waiting alone in a ruined garden for longer than recorded human history, is not softened by any of that context. The VHS tape, which is the closest thing the show has to Rose's own voice, speaking directly to the present moment and to Steven specifically, is conspicuously silent on all of the things that would have been most useful for Steven to hear. She tells him she loves him. She says she has given up being a person so that he can be his own. She says she is made of the choices she has made. She does not address bismuth. She does not address the bubbled, corrupted gems in the temple basement. She does not tell him what is in the chest in Lion's dimension. She says she is sorry without specifying what for. Whether that silence is the result of running out of time, or of deliberate choice about what this particular message needed to contain, or of something that looks uncomfortably like avoidance, the show does not resolve. The fandom's relationship with Rose Quartz was, across the run of the show, one of the most consistent sources of serious and often productive debate. The question of whether the show exonerated her or condemned her was itself a debate, because the show clearly and deliberately refused to do either. It allowed her to be what most real people are, a mixture of genuine goodness and genuine harm, good intentions and bad execution, care that expressed itself in ways that were sometimes not what the people on the receiving end needed. The show asked its audience to hold all of that at once, without resolution, which is harder than it sounds and more honest than most narratives manage. Steven's journey toward being able to articulate anger at his mother, the journey that Future chronicles and that culminates in the session with his therapist, where he finally says plainly that he is angry at her for what she left him with, is the show's most honest engagement with what it means to love someone and be furious at them simultaneously, to grieve someone and also resent what they did, to carry someone's legacy and feel the weight of the parts of that legacy that were not yours to inherit and were not chosen and were not fair. This is a recognizable human experience. The show rendered it with care and precision. And the fandom, which was populated by many people who recognized that experience from their own lives, responded to it with the depth of recognition that only genuinely true things produce. What is left unresolved is the thing that cannot be resolved, because the person who should resolve it is not there. Rose cannot apologize for specific things because she is not present. She cannot explain the choices that needed explaining because she did not know, when she made that tape, which choices would turn out to require explanation. She could not know who Steven would become, what he would need, what he would be capable of bearing, and what would be too heavy. She did the best she could with insufficient information, and some of what she did caused harm that she did not get to witness, let alone address. That is not a forgivable condition exactly. It is a human condition. And the show's decision to let it be that, to not resolve it into either exoneration or condemnation, is one of the things that makes Steven Universe genuinely worth the attention people gave it. Section 17, The Legacy of Spinel and What Pink Diamond Owed Her. Spinel is, by the accounting of many critics and fans, the most emotionally devastating character introduced in the entire Steven Universe story. She appears in the 2019 film and she arrives fully formed, a character with a design inspired by rubber hose animation from the 1930s. All elastic limbs and exaggerated movement, a fighting style that looks simultaneously comedic and genuinely dangerous, and a backstory that is, when you absorb the full weight of it, extraordinarily painful. She was made to be a companion, not a soldier, not a worker, not a political instrument. She was created specifically to be a friend. Her entire identity, her purpose, the reason she existed, was centered on one relationship, and that relationship was abandoned. Pink Diamond, before she was given authority over Earth, before she became Rose Quartz, before she started a rebellion and changed everything, had a companion. Pink and Spinel played together in a garden. The show implies this was a long and genuinely happy period, two beings spending time together in a beautiful place, forming the kind of bond that shapes who you are. And then Pink was given Earth, and she left. She told Spinel to wait. She said it would be a game. She said she would be right back, and she flew away. The detail that the show uses to communicate the full scope of what Spinel experienced in the years that followed is simple and devastating in its simplicity. She stayed in the position Pink had left her in. She did not move. She waited so long and so perfectly still that she effectively froze. The garden grew wild around her. Seasons changed, decades passed, centuries accumulated, and Spinell stood in the same spot, waiting for someone who was not coming. 6,000 years is the number the show gives us. 6,000 years of waiting. The human civilization that currently exists on Earth is approximately the same age. Spinell waited, motionless, in the ruins of a garden, for longer than the entirety of recorded human history. When Steven's broadcast reaches her, his message sent to the galaxy announcing that Pink Diamond was gone, that she had become Steven Spinell, learns two things at once. She learns that the person she has been waiting for is not coming back, and she learns that the person she has been waiting for had an entirely different life that she knew nothing about. A rebellion, a war, a son, a legacy. All of it happened while Spinell stood in the garden waiting to be remembered. The question the film leaves open, and it is a significant omission, is what Pink Diamond actually intended. The show frames her departure as an expression of her immaturity, her tendency to be consumed by whatever was in front of her at any given moment, her capacity to simply forget things that were out of her immediate field of attention. This framing is available, and it is probably partially accurate. Pink Diamond was, by the standards of her civilization, very young. She was impulsive. She became completely absorbed in the life she was building on Earth. But the framing does not entirely resolve the moral question. There is a difference between forgetting and choosing not to remember. And the 6,000 years that elapsed between Pink's departure and Steven's broadcast contain, somewhere inside them, a question about what Pink Diamond knew, about whether there were moments she thought of the garden and chose not to return to it, about whether, at some level, she understood that going back would mean confronting something she did not want to confront, the being she had left behind, who represented a life and a self she was in the process of leaving behind. Whether not returning was forgetting or was avoidance is a question the film does not answer. It is a question, perhaps, that does not have a clean answer. Both things may have been true at different points across 6,000 years. The forget-me-nots are there in the garden when Spinell's story reaches the audience. Actual forget-me-nots, flowers named specifically for the act of not being forgotten. Whether Pink planted them, which would imply some level of awareness that she might not return and something like a guilty acknowledgement of what she was leaving, or whether they grew on their own over centuries, which would make their presence a piece of cosmic irony rather than a private admission, is not specified. They are there in the background, as background details in this show tend to be, sitting in the frame without being commented upon. Spinell's ending is warm. After the events of the film, she joins the remaining three diamonds, who are delighted by her and who welcome her with an enthusiasm that she clearly needed and had not received in a very long time. It is a genuinely lovely resolution, but the film also acknowledges, in the honesty of its storytelling, that the warmth of the resolution does not undo what happened. 6,000 years of waiting do not unhappen because of what comes after. Spinell gets something good at the end. She also endured something that should not have happened to her. The film holds both of those things without pretending that the first cancels the second. That is the right choice. It is also the honest choice, the choice that takes Spinell seriously as a character rather than using her suffering as dramatic setup for a neat resolution. For the fandom, Spinell was a specific kind of emotional event. She arrived in 2019 and she hit the community with a force that was somewhat unexpected. Not because her design and her story were poorly executed, they were extraordinarily well executed, but because her story touched something that was, for many people in the fandom, unexpectedly personal. The experience of investing deeply in a relationship that turned out not to be valued with the same depth on the other side. The experience of waiting for someone who was not coming. The experience of being left behind while someone else moved forward into a life that had no room for you in it. These are recognizable human experiences, and Spinell rendered them with a specificity that made them land hard on people who recognized what she was carrying. The conversations the fandom had about Spinell in the weeks after the film aired were among the more interesting and less contentious discussions the community produced during the entire run of the show. Because Spinell's situation did not easily map onto any of the existing fault lines in the fandom. She was not a case study in racial coding, not primarily a debate about the show's approach to villain redemption, not a flashpoint for the SU Critical versus Defense Force conflict. She was simply a character who had been hurt and who the show treated with care, and the fandom responded to that with care. Which was, in its own quiet way, a reminder of what the community was capable of when it was at its best. Section 18, Jasper, and the question of what happens after the war. There is a category of character in fiction that most narratives do not know what to do with. The character who fought on the wrong side of a conflict, not because they were evil, not because they were stupid, not because they lacked values, but because the values they genuinely held had been built on a foundation of lies they had no part in constructing. The character whose worldview was, from the inside, coherent and principled and earned, and who only discovers from the outside, too late, that the structure it was built on was false. Most narratives demand that this character either convert dramatically to the right side or be defeated and removed from the story. Steven Universe, in its treatment of Jasper, refused both options and produced something stranger and more honest than either. Jasper is a homeworld soldier, a quartz gem, and she was grown in the Beta kindergarten on Earth during the Gem Colonization Project. That Pink Diamond oversaw the colonization that became the Gem War when Rose Quartz and the Crystal Gems rose against it. This makes her, in a technical and somewhat ironic sense, an Earth gem, like Amethyst, though the two of them grew in different kindergartens under different conditions and emerged into very different worlds. Jasper came out of the Beta kindergarten larger and more powerful than standard quartz specifications, a consequence of the rushed conditions under which she was grown soldiers being produced quickly for a war that was already underway. She was, from the moment of her emergence, exceptional. She knew it. Her entire sense of self was built around it. She arrived in the show as an antagonist, sent to Earth by Yellow Diamond to investigate the continued existence of the crystal gems long after the war's end. She was formidable, she was certain, and she was devoted to the homeworld, to the Diamond Authority, to the system that had produced her and given her a role and a purpose within it. Over the course of her time in the story, she made decisions that pushed her further and further from the position she had started in. She fused with a corrupted gem, which was explicitly inadvisable, and which the show presented as an act of someone willing to do anything in pursuit of power she felt she needed. The fusion corrupted her. She ended the main series as one of the corrupted gems healed in the finale, restored to her original form. And then the last shot of the main series showed her standing beside Amethyst, two Earth Quartz gems, from the same planet, from the same general period in that planet's history, side by side. The show ends there, and Jasper's story is left genuinely open in a way that almost no other character's story is. She does not get a redemption arc in the conventional sense. She does not have a moment of conversion where she renounces the homeworld and joins the crystal gems and expresses regret for everything she was before. She simply gets healed. She gets her form back, her mind back, the self she was before the corruption. And what she does with that restored self is not shown. This is exactly right as a narrative choice, and it deserves to be said clearly. Not everyone who fought on the wrong side of a war has a dramatic moment of conversion. Not everyone who was the enemy has a journey toward becoming an ally. Some people survive the end of the conflict that defined their lives and simply have to figure out what they are now. What their identity means when the structure that gave it shape no longer exists. What their values are worth when the system that told them those values were correct turns out to have been built on lies. That is a genuine human experience, the experience of people who served causes that failed, who fought for things that turned out to be wrong, who have to find a way to continue living in a world that has moved past the version of reality they organized their lives around. Jasper is in that position at the end of the show, and the show does not pretend to know what she does with it. There is also the specific dimension of Jasper's relationship with Pink Diamond. She was grown under Pink Diamond's colonization. She fought in the war that began under Pink Diamond's authority. She fought against the Crystal Gems, and the Crystal Gems were led by Rose Quartz, and Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. The person Jasper was fighting for, and the person Jasper was fighting against, were the same person wearing different faces. This is not a small revelation for a character whose entire identity was organized around her devotion to the diamond she had been grown to serve. The system that gave Jasper her purpose and her self-understanding was constructed and then abandoned by the very being at its center. What Jasper makes of this is, again, not shown. The show leaves that particular weight for the audience to imagine her carrying into a future it does not depict. The final image, Jasper and Amethyst, standing together, both Earth gems, both quartzes from the planet that was the center of the war that shaped their existences, is one of the show's most quietly significant visual moments. It does not tell you that they are friends. It does not tell you that anything between them has been resolved or that any conversation has been had. It just places them in the same frame, in the aftermath of the same healing, two beings who came from the same ground and have arrived at the same moment from entirely different directions. What happens next is yours to wonder about. The show, correctly, does not pretend to know. Section 918, the Internet era this show belongs to. Steven Universe is not simply a children's animated series. It is a document of a specific moment in Internet history. It lived inside a particular 5-year window, roughly 2013 to 2018, with the tail extending into 2,020 inches, which a set of specific conditions held simultaneously in a way that they have not quite held before or since. Social media was dominant, but still early enough to be experienced as genuinely new. Tumblr, specifically, was at the height of its cultural influence as a space for fan communities. The vocabulary of progressive social politics had made its way fully into fan community discourse, but the norms around how that vocabulary should be applied were still being argued over in real time. And the particular generation that had grown up with the internet was entering its adolescence and young adulthood with habits of engagement and expectations of community that older generations did not have and did not always recognize. These conditions produce something that the world has not quite seen again since. The Steven Universe fandom of approximately 2014 to 2017, in its specific combination of creativity and intensity, and occasional terrible destructiveness, and genuine transformative potential. A community that was, all at once, making extraordinary art and having important conversations, and causing real harm and advocating for real change and reproducing real toxicity. A community that contained the best and worst of what happens when a generation that has been told it is uniquely capable of changing things decides that a cartoon is worth fighting for. The show could not have been what it was in a different era. The network restrictions it was navigating were specific to the cultural moment they occupied a network, calculating what it could risk based on the audience it had, the cultural conversation happening around it, and the regulatory environment it operated in. The fandom could not have been what it was in a different era. Tumblr's specific mechanics, its reblogging culture, its way of rewarding certain kinds of engagement, produced specific kinds of community dynamics that other platforms do not replicate. The conversations the show generated about queer representation in children's media landed at a moment when those conversations were already happening at scale, when the ground was prepared for them, when people were already asking what they had a right to expect from the media that was supposed to represent them. The show was a creature of its moment. So was the fandom. So were the controversies. This is worth holding in mind when thinking about what the whole thing means, because it means that some of what happened cannot be cleanly extracted from the specific conditions of the specific moment and used as a lesson about fan culture in general, or about queer media in general, or about children's animation in general. Some of it is specifically about Tumblr in 2015. Some of it is specifically about Cartoon Network's position in the media landscape in 2016. Some of it is specifically about the particular combination of intensity and youth and representation hunger that defined this particular community in this particular window of time. What can be extracted are patterns. The pattern of a fandom that loved something so intensely that the intensity became its own problem. The pattern of progressive political vocabulary being applied in ways that served social aggression rather than social justice. The pattern of creators and fans trying to maintain a relationship across the mediated distance of social media and finding that the distance was harder to bridge than it seemed. The pattern of institutional restrictions shaping art in ways that were not visible to audiences who thought they were seeing a creator's full vision. These patterns are not specific to Steven Universe. They appear in different forms in the history of many other fan communities. But they appear in Steven Universe with unusual clarity and unusually complete documentation because the community was large and active and talked about itself constantly and saved what it produced. It is one of the best documented examples of these patterns available, and that documentation is, in its own strange way, part of its legacy. The shows that came after it, the ones that built on the space Steven Universe helped to create in children's animation, operated in a somewhat different environment. The conversations it had sparked had changed what was possible. The precedents it had set, including the GLAD Award and the Peabody, including the demonstrated commercial viability of explicitly queer content for family audiences, including the creative strategies Sugar had developed for navigating network restrictions, were available to the people who came next. They did not start from zero. They started from where Steven Universe had gotten to. That is a real inheritance, and it matters. Whatever else the show was or was not, whatever its successes and failures and the complicated history of the community that formed around it, it moved the ground, and the people who came after were standing on different ground because of it. Section 20. The off-colors and what the show said about defects. In the latter portion of the main series, when Steven and Lars found themselves stranded on Homeworld following a sequence of events that neither of them had planned for, the show introduced a group of gems that became, in the time they were on screen, one of its warmest and most beloved ensembles. The off-colors were gems who did not conform to the standard specifications of their types, gems who had emerged from the geological production process different from what was intended, and who had therefore been designated as defective and marked for destruction by the Homeworld system. They had been hiding in abandoned tunnels for an unspecified but clearly very long time, surviving on the margins of a civilization that had decided they had no right to exist. Fluorite was a fusion of 6 different gems who had chosen to remain fused indefinitely, moving slowly and speaking in long, gently searching sentences. Her body an expression of a relationship that the Homeworld considered inherently inappropriate because it crossed gem types that were not supposed to combine. Rhodonite was a fusion of a ruby and a pearl, another cross-type fusion, doubly transgressive by Homeworld standards. 2 beings who had found each other and decided that being together permanently was worth the danger it put them in. Padparadscha was a sapphire whose future vision was delayed. She experienced the future with the same clarity that other sapphires did, but her timing was off, so she reported events with great enthusiasm and complete sincerity immediately after they had already happened to everyone present. And the Rutile twins were a single gem who had split during their emergence into 2 connected bodies sharing 1 gemstone, considered defective for their unusual form even though they were, by any meaningful measure, entirely themselves. These characters were beloved quickly and with good reason. They were written with care. They were drawn with distinctive visual personality, and they embodied, in a concentrated form, one of the show's most consistent preoccupations: the question of what it means to be considered wrong by a system that has defined what right looks like, and whether the system's definition of right has anything to do with actual value or actual worth. The off-colors were not defective. They were different from what the Homeworld specifications called for. But the specifications were not a neutral description of objective value. They were a political document, a set of rules about what kinds of beings the Homeworld's power structure wanted to produce, and what kinds it found inconvenient or threatening. Fluorite's extended fusion was not a defect. It was a choice, an expression of relationship, a way of being together that the Homeworld could not accommodate within its framework. Rhodonite's existence as a cross-type fusion was not a defect. It was love, the same kind of love that Garnet represented, the same kind that the show had been celebrating from its very beginning. Padparadscha's delayed future vision was not a defect. It was the particular shape of her consciousness, different from the standard Sapphire model, in ways that made her genuinely useful, in ways those around her recognized and valued, even without the Homeworld's endorsement. The off-colors as a group were the show's most explicit statement about the relationship between conformity and worth. The Homeworld had decided they were defective, which meant they were not worth the resources of letting them continue to exist, which meant they had spent unknown centuries in hiding. The show presented this as a simple and legible injustice. The system was wrong, its definitions were serving power rather than truth, and the beings it had designated worthless were in fact extraordinary. This is not a complicated message, but the clarity of the message was, in context, the point. The show was saying, directly and without much hedging, that the systems which define who is acceptable and who is not are systems built to serve particular interests, and that the beings those systems exclude are not thereby shown to be without value. They are shown to be outside the interests of the people running the system. For a fandom composed substantially of people who had themselves been told, in various ways and by various systems, that they did not fit the acceptable specifications, that their sexuality, or their gender, or their neurology, or their body, or their way of moving through the world was defective in some way that required correction or concealment. The off-colors were personal. The fandom did not miss the connection. The discourse around the off-colors was, compared to the discourse around many other elements of the show, remarkably gentle and warm. People loved them without argument, identified with them without competition, made fan art of them with obvious joy. In the specific history of a fandom that was also capable of producing the uglier things we have been discussing, the response to the off-colors was a reminder that the community could, under the right conditions, simply receive something and love it. Lars's arc, which became entangled with the off-colors story in the later seasons, is worth treating on its own terms here. Lars Barriga, who had been a peripheral human character for most of the show's run, Steven's workplace acquaintance at the Big Donut, a teenager with anxieties about how others perceived him and a tendency to navigate those anxieties through deflection and occasional unkindness, underwent, in the later seasons, one of the more significant character transformations in the show. He died. He was revived by Steven's healing tears in a process that paralleled what Rose had done with Lion, and he came back different. Pink. Transformed. No longer entirely human in the way he had been before, no longer aging at a normal rate, no longer able to eat in the way he previously had. And he led the off-colors home. This person, who had spent most of the series being someone who let other people down when things got difficult, found himself in a situation where there were people depending on him, and he had to decide what kind of person he was going to be in that situation. He decided to be the person who got them home. He became the captain of a spaceship made from a cracked shell, guiding a group of gems the homeworld had written off across the galaxy to safety. And when he finally arrived back in Beach City, he was not the person who had left. He was something new. The show handled this transformation with evident care and affection. What it did not do was tell us what Lars becomes in the years after his return, how he manages a life on Earth with a body that is permanently changed, what it looks like to be 18 years old in most senses, and simultaneously something quite different, how Beach City absorbs a person who can no longer quite fully belong to it in the way he did before. These are open questions. They are interesting questions. The show leaves them open with confidence that the life it built for Lars, whatever form it takes in the years after the story ends, is worth living. That is the right note on which to leave a character like Lars. Not explained, just trusted. Section 21. The Cluster, the Corruption, and the Limits of Resolution. One of the most genuinely dark things in Steven Universe is not a villain, not a war, not an act of cruelty between characters we know. It is a geological phenomenon sitting at the center of the Earth, and what it represents, and what the show does and does not say about it. The Cluster is what Homeworld did with the remains of the gems who were corrupted in the aftermath of the war, not the corrupted gems themselves, not the beings who had been transformed into feral, instinct-driven creatures, and who were eventually healed in the show's finale, but the shards, the pieces, the fragments of corrupted gems who were further broken, whose gemstones were cracked and split until what remained were fragments that were still alive in some minimal and deeply distressed sense, pieces of consciousness that retained enough awareness to suffer but not enough to act or speak or understand what had happened to them. Homeworld scientists took millions of these shards and forcibly fused them into a single entity, a vast, proto-Gestalt consciousness buried in the Earth's mantle and designed to eventually emerge and destroy the planet. The rationale was strategic, and the execution was, by any moral accounting, monstrous. These were not raw materials. These were people, or the fragmented remains of people, pressed together against their will into a shape they had not chosen, used as a mechanism for a planetary weapon. The show does not shy away from the horror of this. It names it clearly. When Steven makes contact with the Cluster in the episode that deals directly with it, he does not find a mindless geological formation. He finds something in pain, something pulled in millions of directions simultaneously by the conflicting impulses of the millions of fragments that compose it. Unable to find any equilibrium or rest, aware enough to suffer and not aware enough to do anything about the suffering, Steven helps the Cluster find a kind of internal equilibrium. He helps it bubble itself, to find a state in which the conflicting forces pulling at it are not at war with each other. It becomes stable. It becomes, in a limited sense, peaceful. And it eventually helps the crystal gems in the show's final battle. lending the force of its enormous power to a fight it has no independent stake in, other than the fact that Steven helped it when it was in pain. This is the show doing what it does best, finding the possibility of connection and help in the most unlikely places, treating even the most alien and damaged form of consciousness as something worth engaging with rather than simply using or avoiding. But what the show does not do, what it cannot do within the time it has and the emotional register it is working in, is fully account for what the cluster represents in terms of the Gem Wars unclosed books. The cluster is millions of individual shards, fragments of people who had names and histories and allegiances and relationships. They were crystal gems, mostly, people who had fought for something, who had chosen a side that cost them everything. Their corruption was already a tragedy. Their shattering into shards was a further horror. Their forcible fusion into a weapon was something beyond that. And the show's resolution, Steven helping the cluster find equilibrium, the cluster bubbling itself in the Earth's core, addresses the most immediate crisis without addressing the deeper question of what was done to those shards, and whether anything like justice or restoration is possible for them. The healing that occurs in the show's finale restores the corrupted gems who were still intact, the beings who had been transformed into feral creatures, but who had remained whole enough that the process of corruption could be reversed. But the shards are something else. They are fragments of beings who no longer exist as individuals, and whether the healing light that restored the corrupted gems did anything for the millions of individual shards fused inside the cluster is not addressed. The cluster, in the show's finale, is shown experiencing the healing light, but its fate is not clearly resolved. Whether it becomes something other than what it was, whether the individual shards within it are somehow restored, or given peace, or remain in their fused state forever, is one of the genuine openings the show leaves that is probably not openable in any satisfying narrative sense. Some things that were done cannot be undone. Some losses are so total that the only honest response is to acknowledge them and carry them forward. The corruption itself as a historical event also carries questions that the show raises without fully resolving. The corrupting light that the 3 remaining diamonds launched at the end of the war was deployed in grief and rage, and it was, the show tells us, not fully understood even by the people who launched it. They believed it would kill every gem on Earth. It did not. It transformed them into something worse in many ways than death. And the diamonds, discovering much later what had actually happened, had to reckon with the fact that the weapon they had used had produced an outcome they had not intended and had not known about, and had done nothing to address for 5,000 years. The show's answer to this is the healing, the act of all 4 diamond powers working together, which is the only combination capable of reversing what was done. And the healing works. The corrupted gems are restored, in the finale, in a sequence that is visually beautiful and emotionally satisfying, in the way that resolutions need to be emotionally satisfying to work as narrative. But it works as narrative in part by not asking the harder questions, by not dwelling on what 5,000 years of corruption meant for the individual consciousness of each gem who experienced it, by not tracing the specific losses that accumulated across those millennia. The show can give us Centipedal being partially restored and showing Steven her memories of the war and her devotion to the crystal gem symbol. It cannot give us the full accounting of what 5,000 years of being unable to recognize yourself cost any individual. The healing is shown as complete. The cost of what preceded the healing is acknowledged but not fully rendered. That is, again, probably the right choice. The full rendering would be the whole show. But it is worth noting, in a careful accounting of what Steven Universe did and did not do, that the resolution its ending offers is a resolution that the show itself, in its most honest moments, knows is partial. Section 22, Garnet and what fusion actually meant. Garnet is the character who holds the most secrets longest, and who makes that holding look effortless, and who turns out to be carrying more than anyone understood. She is, from the show's first episode, a figure of quiet authority, composed, direct, warm in a contained way, someone who knows more than she says and whose silence reads as strength rather than withholding. She is also, as the show reveals in the first season's finale, not a single being at all. She is a fusion, a permanent fusion of 2 gems named Ruby and Sapphire who have been together long enough that being Garnet is as natural to them as breathing is to a person. They are together because they want to be. They chose each other. They have been choosing each other continuously for thousands of years. This reveal is one of the best constructed plot moments in the entire show, built up carefully, given sufficient foreshadowing that a rewatch makes it feel inevitable without the first watch feeling like it was telegraphed. And what it does to Garnet retroactively is important. Everything we have understood about her composure takes on additional dimension. She is not composed because she is simple. She is composed because she is the ongoing resolution of two very different perspectives and emotional registers, held in continuous integration. Sapphire sees the future. She is a future seer, a homeworld advisor whose power gave her access to what was coming in ways that could be overwhelming and isolating. Ruby is immediate, passionate, reactive, fiercely present in each specific moment. Garnet is both of those things, integrated, balanced, the result of a relationship that was so strong it became a new and distinct self. The show's treatment of fusion across its run is one of its most sustained and coherent metaphors. Fusions are relationships made visible and physical. The quality of a fusion reflects the quality of the relationship that produces it. Malachite, the forced fusion of lapis lazuli and jasper, is enormous and unstable, and full of internal conflict, a visual representation of two beings who do not want to be together and are held together by force and resentment. Stevani, the fusion of Stephen and Connie, is graceful and warm and a little awkward in the way of most adolescent experiences, a person who exists at the intersection of two people who care about each other and are still figuring out exactly how. Alexandrite, the rare fusion of all three crystal gems, is impressive and slightly unwieldy, a being who requires significant effort from all three of her components to maintain. The metaphor is LGBTQ representation in the most direct and unambiguous sense. Rebecca Sugar has said so explicitly, the fusions are relationships. The relationship between Ruby and Sapphire is a romantic relationship between two beings coded as female. The show's celebration of fusion, its insistence that the most powerful and stable fusions are the ones built on genuine love and mutual respect and chosen commitment, is a celebration of those relationships. Specifically, the homeworld's prohibition on cross-type fusions, its designation of unauthorized fusion as something defective and threatening, maps directly onto the real-world structures that have historically prohibited and stigmatized same-sex relationships. This is why the network restrictions on how explicitly the show could depict Ruby and Sapphire's relationship were so painful in their specific character. The show had built an entire cosmological framework in which Garnet's existence was a continuous statement about the validity and power and beauty of the relationship at her core. And the network wanted that statement made more ambiguous, made less visible, made easier to deny for the parents who might find it threatening. The show's creators pushed back against this as effectively as they could. And eventually, in Reunited, they got to show the wedding, got to show the kiss, got to let the metaphor become explicit in the way it had always been pointing toward. But the years of restraint that preceded that moment were years in which the show was making its argument as clearly as it could within the space it was allowed to occupy. Garnet's role in the show's controversies is worth naming specifically. She was, for much of the series, the character the fandom debated least. Not because she was simple, she was not, but because the show handled her with such consistent care, and because her emotional core, the relationship between Ruby and Sapphire, and what that relationship represents, was one of the areas of the show where almost everyone agreed. The Ruby and Sapphire wedding in Reunited was one of the moments in the show's history that produced the most unambiguous joy in the fandom, not the complicated, contested joy that accompanied many of the show's significant moments, but genuine, clean, widely shared happiness. People watched two characters they had loved for years get married in a ceremony that was funny and beautiful, and that finally said out loud what the show had been saying quietly since its first season. And the fandom, which was capable of arguing about almost anything, mostly just received that moment and was glad. That gladness is also part of the story, not just the controversies. Not just the failures and the ugliness and the difficult debates, the moments when the show did exactly what it set out to do, and the fandom felt exactly what the show wanted it to feel, and the experience of watching it was what it should have been all along. Those moments happen too. They are worth remembering alongside everything else. Section 23 Peridot and the slowest possible redemption arc. If the Diamond arc represents the show's redemption thesis under strain the question of whether empathy can truly reach beings who have caused harm at civilizational scale, then Peridot's arc represents that thesis. at its most successful and most patient. Because Peridot's transformation from antagonist to crystal gem is the one that the show had the most time to develop, the one it handled with the most care and the most willingness to let things fail before they succeeded, and the one that most clearly demonstrated what the show actually believed about how people change and what change looks like from the inside. Peridot arrived as a bureaucrat of the homeworld's colonization operation, a technician, sent to assess the status of the Earth colony following a long period of silence from homeworld's perspective. She was contemptuous, efficient, and entirely convinced of the correctness of the system she worked within. The homeworld was right. The crystal gems were wrong. The humans were resources at best. Earth was a failed colony whose remaining gem presence was an inconvenience to be addressed. She saw no complexity in any of this because the system she operated within had given her no framework for seeing complexity. Her values were the homeworld's values, absorbed without examination, applied without reflection. Her initial encounters with the crystal gems and with Steven went, from her perspective, badly. She was captured, escaped, was recaptured, was forced into an increasingly extended proximity with beings she had been trained to dismiss, and a planet she had been trained to see as beneath consideration. And then, gradually, the proximity started to do what proximity does. When you cannot escape it, it made things particular. The Earth became not the Earth in the abstract, but this specific place, with this specific beach and this specific sky, and these specific people who she had been living alongside long enough to have developed something resembling actual feelings about them. The moment the fandom usually points to as Peridot's genuine turn is the episode in which she calls Yellow Diamond from Earth, having decided that she has information Yellow Diamond needs to hear about a threat to the planet. It is a moment that requires real courage from Peridot. She is a homeworld gem calling a diamond directly, something that is not normally done, to tell that diamond something the diamond will not want to hear. And when Yellow Diamond dismisses her, when the diamond who Peridot had organized her entire value system around shows herself to be less interested in truth than in maintaining control, Peridot calls her a clod, out loud, to a diamond. In the homeworld's power structure, this is the equivalent of a civil servant calling the head of state a fool directly to their face. It is a genuinely significant moment of moral courage, made funny by the word she chooses, made genuinely moving by what it costs her. This is how the show believed change works. Not in a single dramatic moment of conversion, not in a speech about the wrongness of what you believed before, but in the slow accumulation of particular experiences that make the abstract general less believable than the specific real. Peridot did not change because someone argued her into a new position. She changed because she spent enough time with the Earth and its people, and the crystal gems to have formed actual attachments that made the homeworld's framework feel increasingly inadequate as an explanation of what she was experiencing. The change was earned through time and through difficulty, and through the specific lived texture of a life that was not what she had expected it to be. The fandom loved Peridot with notable consistency across the run of the show. She was a character who generated warmth in the community rather than conflict, who the fandom was rooting for rather than arguing about. This is itself significant when you consider how much of the fandom's relationship with the show was characterized by argument. Peridot was the exception. She was the place where the community could simply be glad about something without needing to debate whether it was valid to be glad. And this is probably because her arc was the one where the show's beliefs about change and about what change requires were most fully and most patiently realized. She was the show's thesis most completely incarnated. And the community recognized that, even when it could not articulate it directly, and responded to it with the warmth that the thesis deserved. Section 24. The Steven Universe Fandom and Mental Health. One of the most persistent threads in discussions of the Steven Universe fandom present in the community's self-understanding from very early in the show's run was the relationship between the fandom and mental health. This is not a comfortable topic, and it does not have a clean or simple story to tell, but it is one that belongs in any honest accounting of what the Steven Universe community was and why it operated the way it did. The show attracted, in significant numbers, people who were dealing with mental health challenges. This is documented not in clinical studies but in the community's own record of itself, in the posts and discussions that circulated through the fandom across the years of the show's run, in which people talked about what the show meant to them in terms that were sometimes quite explicitly about mental health. The show helped me through my depression. The crystal gems are why I'm still here. I watched this show in the hospital. These statements appeared in the community's discourse regularly enough that they were not outliers. They were part of the texture of what the community was. And the show itself, particularly in its later seasons and in Steven Universe Future, became more and more explicit about mental health as a subject. It depicted anxiety. It depicted grief. It depicted the specific damage done by prolonged suppression of difficult emotions. It depicted, in Future, a protagonist who was not okay and who needed help that he was not able to provide for himself. It depicted therapy as a legitimate and valuable response to psychological struggle. These depictions were, for many viewers, the first time they had seen their own experience reflected clearly in a piece of media they were watching regularly. The show was not just entertaining them. It was, in some cases, giving them frameworks for understanding their own experience that they had not previously had. This combination, a large audience with elevated rates of mental health challenges, watching a show that was explicitly engaging with mental health themes, in a fandom culture that was already emotionally intense, produced conditions that were, in retrospect, not always healthy. The fandom could be a place of genuine support, where people who were struggling found community and felt less alone. It could also be a place where mental health language was used in ways that were not always helpful, where the vocabulary of trauma and harm and triggering was applied in contexts that stretched those terms beyond their useful meaning, where the intensity of the community added pressure to people who were already under significant pressure. The Zamiai incident, the Jessie Zook affair, and the ongoing pattern of concentrated fandom hostility directed at individuals, these things happened in a community that also contained, in genuine good faith, enormous amounts of mutual support and care. Both things were real. The support was real, the harm was real. They were not in different parts of the fandom separated by some clear line. They were often in the same people, at different times, under different conditions. The person who sent a supportive message to a stranger struggling with anxiety might be the same person who joined a pile-on against a fan artist in a different week. The same community that told its members you are not alone also told some of its members, at particular moments, that they were not welcome. These contradictions are uncomfortable. They are also documented honestly what the fandom was. Steven Universe Future's explicit treatment of mental health, the therapy scenes, the naming of trauma, the depiction of Steven's psychological state with clinical precision was the show doing something the fandom needed to see, and doing it at a moment when the fandom had already been through several years of its own psychological turbulence. Whether the timing was conscious or coincidental, whether Sugar was aware of the fandom's relationship with mental health in designing what Future would be about, is something that cannot be known from the outside. What can be said is that the show, in its final chapter, was addressing the same territory that had defined the community's most difficult moments, and addressing it with the same honesty and care that characterized the show at its best. The lasting impact of Steven Universe on conversations about mental health in children's and young adult media is real. The show made it possible to talk about certain things more directly in its specific genre than had been possible before. The shows that came after it, including many that explicitly cited Sugar's work as an influence built on the ground the show had prepared. The conversation about what children's and family animation is allowed to address and how directly it can address it is different now than it was when the show began. And some of that difference is the show's doing. Section 25, The Human Zoo, and questions the show left standing. Blue Diamond kept a zoo on one of the moons of the solar system. This is a sentence that requires sitting with for a moment. Because the casual way the show introduces, it does not immediately communicate the full weight of what it is describing. A zoo, containing humans. Living descendants of people taken from Earth approximately 6,000 years ago, who have been living inside a perfectly managed artificial environment across many generations, entirely unaware that there is anything outside the environment they inhabit, entirely unaware that they are exhibits, rather than inhabitants of the only world they know. The humans in the zoo were given new names upon arrival, not the names they came with, but homeworld-assigned designations that stripped them of one layer of their own identity before they even began their captivity. They were comfortable by the material standards of comfort. They were fed and cared for and kept in conditions that were, in their immediate physical texture, pleasant. They were not aware of being imprisoned. They had no framework for understanding their situation as imprisonment because the alternative to their situation, the planet their ancestors had been taken from, the concept of a world that was not the zoo was simply not part of their experience. This is one of the show's darkest constructions, and it is treated with considerable moral seriousness in the episodes that address it directly. The zoo is not presented as benign. The fact that the humans inside it are comfortable does not resolve the fact that they are there without consent, without knowledge, without the possibility of choosing anything other than the world that has been arranged for them. The show understands and communicates clearly that comfort without freedom is not a neutral condition, that the humans in the zoo are harmed by being there even if they do not experience that harm as suffering in any conventional sense. The harm is structural, not experiential, and the show was capable of engaging with structural harm in ways that were not common in children's animation. Steven's visit to the zoo and the events surrounding it produce one of the more genuinely strange stretches of episodes in the series. The atmosphere is unsettling in ways that are difficult to pin down, and that the show seems to know cannot be fully resolved within the emotional register it is operating in. It introduces Greg, briefly his presence in the zoo, brought there by Blue Diamond as a kind of living exhibit, is its own particular horror, delivered in the show's characteristically underplayed way. And it introduces the humans in the zoo as people, as individuals with distinct personalities and relationships and their own internal dynamics, in ways that make the ethical horror of their situation more rather than less visible. The resolution for the humans in the zoo is not given full treatment. Some of them, when offered the choice, decide to come to Earth to leave the only world they have ever known for a planet that is their ancestral home but is not, in any immediate experiential sense, their home. What happens to those people? How they adapt? What it is like to arrive on Earth as a person who was born in a zoo on a moon? How they are received by the world they have been brought to? What kind of life it is possible to build for oneself in those circumstances is something the show does not follow through. The plot point is resolved. The human reality of the situation is not. This is one of the places where the show's preference for emotional resolution over complete narrative accounting is most visible. The zoom is on Steven's emotional journey, on the crystal gem's healing, on the diamond's transformation. The humans in the zoo are important enough to introduce and morally significant enough to give a choice to. But what their choice produces in their lives is off-screen, implied but not depicted. In a show about the importance of every individual's experience and the harm done when individuals are treated as resources rather than as ends in themselves, leaving the zoo humans off-screen at the moment when their real lives begin is a noticeable elision, not an unforgivable one. The show was already doing an enormous amount simultaneously, but a noticeable one. The zoo, in retrospect, also functions as a compressed symbol of the broader critique of the Diamond Authority's relationship with organic life. The gems colonized planets and extracted their resources without regard for the organic life those planets supported. The zoo is the flip side of that, a gesture at preservation that is actually just a different mode of extraction. The humans are not being consumed the way a planet's mineral resources are consumed, but they are being kept, maintained, held in conditions that serve Blue Diamond's purposes without any reference to their own. They are decorative captives. The gesture of preservation is in the service of the preserver's needs, not the preserved. This is a critique of a real pattern, the pattern of conservationism that protects things in ways that serve the interests of the powerful rather than the interests of the things being protected. The show does not make this critique explicitly, but it is available in the text for anyone looking for it. Section 26, Pearl and the Weight of a Kept Secret. Pearl is one of the most psychologically complex characters in Steven Universe, and one of the most carefully rendered portraits of a person shaped by a specific kind of long-term harm. She is, at the beginning of the show, clearly dealing with something. She is precise to the point of anxiety. She is devoted to Steven with an intensity that has an edge of grief underneath it. She speaks of rose quartz with a reverence that is also something more complicated, something that, over the course of the show, gradually reveals itself to be the reverence of someone who loved and was loved back, but not in the way or to the degree they needed, and who has spent thousands of years since the loss living inside that incompleteness. But Pearl's central psychological fact, the one that shapes everything else about her, is not fully visible until late in the show's run. She has been under a compulsion for thousands of years. Pink Diamond, before she became rose quartz, gave Pearl a direct command using the authority she had as a diamond, which meant the command was not a request or an instruction but a constraint that Pearl could not choose to override. The command was, "Do not tell anyone what you know about pink diamond. Do not reveal that rose quartz was pink diamond. Keep the secret." Pearl kept the secret. Not because she chose to in the way that ordinary people choose to keep secrets, weighing the costs and benefits and deciding the weight of the confidence outweighs the cost of the concealment, but because she could not do otherwise. The command was embedded in her in a way that her own choices could not reach. When situations arose across thousands of years where telling the truth about Pink Diamond would have mattered, where Stephen's understanding of his own history, his own mother, his own identity was being shaped by incomplete or incorrect information, Pearl was present, knowing what she knew and unable to say it. The barrier between what she knew and what she could express was not a decision she was making. It was a wall that had been built inside her by someone who had the authority to build it. This is, in the terms the show carefully constructs around it, a portrait of a specific kind of harm. Not the harm of being deceived, or the harm of being abandoned, or the harm of being physically damaged. The harm of having your capacity for honest expression overridden by someone with power over you. The harm of being made into a keeper of a secret you did not choose to keep, that benefited someone else's interests rather than your own, that you carried not by choice but by compulsion, and that you continued to carry long after the person who imposed it on you was gone and incapable of releasing you from it. The show navigates this with the intelligence it brings to its best material. It does not simplify Pearl's situation into victimhood. She is not a passive figure, not someone defined only by what was done to her. She has her own choices, her own agency, her own complicated feelings about Rose that include genuine love and grief, and something that in a human would be called resentment, though the show lets that emotion be complicated rather than resolved. She grows across the series. She makes decisions and learns from them and becomes, gradually, someone who is finding ways to be herself that do not require hiding behind devotion to someone else. The scene in which she is finally released from the compulsion when the specific phrasing that allows her to speak is found is one of the show's most quietly emotional moments, not because it is dramatic, but because it shows a person finally able to say something they have been carrying without being able to set it down for thousands of years. Pearl's arc is, across the full run of the show, one of the most complete and the most honest. The show did not have a fully clean ending to give her the questions of who she is outside of her devotion to Rose, of what her future looks like, of the mysterious human woman whose number she may or may not have called, are among the show's genuine openings rather than its resolutions. But the opening feels right for Pearl in a way that some of the show's more resolved endings do not. Because Pearl is a character for whom the question of who she is when she is not performing a role is the central question of her existence, and the show is honest enough to know that that question is not answerable in a series finale. It is the work of a life. The show puts her in the position of being able to start doing that work. Where the work leads is, correctly, left open. Section 27. The fandom's best moments and what they prove. It would be dishonest to close this accounting of the Steven Universe fandom without spending time on its best moments, not because the good cancels the bad, but because any account that only documents the failures is as incomplete as one that only celebrates the successes. The community that formed around this show was capable of genuine beauty, genuine generosity, genuine creativity, and genuine connection. Those things were real. They deserve to be named with the same directness as everything else we have discussed. The fan art that the Steven Universe community produced across the years of the show's run was, taken as a whole, extraordinary. Not just in volume, though. The volume was staggering, but in quality and in the specific care that went into it. Artists who were just beginning when the show started developed, over its run, into genuinely accomplished illustrators. People who had never drawn before picked up a stylus or a pencil because this show made them want to try. The community built around fan art was, at its best, a genuinely supportive environment where people shared work in progress, gave feedback that was specific and kind, celebrated each other's growth and development. It was a place where people who were not professionals were treated as artists, where the activity of making something and sharing it was valued for its own sake rather than only for its professional potential. The fan music community was equally remarkable. Steven Universe attracted musicians who were moved to respond to the show's songs with their own songs, who wrote original pieces in the show's musical world, who produced covers and arrangements and remixes that were sometimes genuinely excellent as pieces of music independent of their connection to the source material. The show's composers Ivy Tran and Surashu were known to engage with fan music when they encountered it, and that engagement was part of what made the community feel like the relationship between the show and its audience was genuinely bidirectional. The accessibility projects that members of the fandom created transcriptions of episodes for deaf viewers, audio descriptions for blind viewers, translated subtitles in languages. The official release did not support, were labors of love that took significant time and skill, and produced real benefits for community members who would otherwise have had more limited access to the thing they cared about. These projects were not commercially motivated. They were done because people wanted other people to be able to enjoy something they loved, and they were willing to do significant work to make that possible. The fundraising and mutual aid that happened within the fandom, money raised for community members in financial difficulty, support coordinated for fans dealing with health crises, the kind of informal support networks that form in communities where people feel genuinely connected to each other. These things also happened. They were not news in the way that the controversies were news. They did not generate the kind of wide documentation that the incidents of harassment generated, but they were real, and they were significant to the people involved, and they were part of what the community was. What does it mean that all of these things, the beauty and the ugliness, the generosity and the cruelty, came from the same place? From the same community, animated by the same deep investment in the same show? It means what has always been true about human communities, that their capacity for good and their capacity for harm are not separate things. They emerge from the same source. The passion that makes people create extraordinary art can, under different conditions and with different triggers, make them cruel. The love that makes people support each other across distances can, when it encounters the specific dynamics of online social media, express itself as collective pressure on individuals. The intensity that produces remarkable creativity also produces remarkable destructiveness. There is no version of the Steven Universe fandom that keeps the creativity and loses the ugliness, because they came from the same place. What was possible was what always is, doing the work of choosing, as consciously and as often as possible, which direction the intensity flows. The fandom at its best did that choosing well. It made things worth making. It had conversations worth having. It built real connections between real people. And the people who experience the fandom at its best carry that with them, even now, just as they carry the memory of the show itself. Section 28. A final note. We have been at this for a long time now. We have covered a lot of ground controversies and creative achievements in fandom dynamics and institutional politics, and the specific texture of what it was like to be inside a particular online community during a particular window of time. We have talked about things that were serious and things that were absurd and things that were both at once. We have tried as consistently as possible to be honest about all of it, to not simplify, to not flatten, to not let either the celebration or the critique have the whole story to itself. What is left, at the end of all of this, is something simpler. A show. An imperfect, ambitious, sometimes frustrating, sometimes genuinely extraordinary show that said certain things and meant them and tried to build a world around them. A show that said love is real and change is possible, and the past does not have to determine the future, and tried to prove it through the specific details of specific characters across hundreds of episodes. A show that generated a community of people who cared about those things, sometimes in ways that were healthy and generative and beautiful, and sometimes in ways that were not. A show that fought, from the inside, against the institutional forces that wanted to limit what it could say and largely won those fights, incrementally and persistently over years. The controversies of Steven Universe are part of its story. They cannot be separated from it, and they should not be. But they are not the whole story. The whole story also includes the songs, the careful visual language, the characters who changed slowly and really, the representation that reached people who needed it. The conversations that needed to be had and were had, imperfectly but seriously, by a community that was willing to take a cartoon seriously enough to argue about it with genuine intellectual investment. Steven drove away from Beach City at the end of Future. He drove towards something he had not defined yet. The show did not follow him there. The story ended at the moment of beginning, which is, in the tradition of the most honest coming-of-age stories, the correct place to end it. What he finds, wherever he goes, is not shown. What he makes of the life his mother left him, the power she gave him, the history he was born into, is his own to determine in a future the show does not need to depict. That ending is the show's clearest statement about what it believed. Not that things get resolved, not that the questions get answered, not that the weight gets put down permanently, but that you can carry what you carry and still move. That you can love the people who gave you difficult things to hold and also be honest about the difficulty. That the work of becoming yourself is the work of a whole life and not something that concludes at any single moment. That you go. And the going is enough. The show is still there whenever you want to return to it. The songs are still in people's heads. The characters are still being drawn and written and thought about in corners of the internet that never entirely let go of the things they love. Steven Universe is not gone. It is just finished. And finished things, unlike ongoing things, have the particular quality of being fully available, of offering themselves completely every time you return to them, of being the same every time while you are different. Go back to it sometime. Watch it with what you know now about everything it was doing, everything it was fighting for, everything it cost the people who made it and the people who loved it. It holds up. The songs hold up. The feelings hold up. We will see you in the next one. Wherever you are, whatever time it is there, we hope the night is quiet and that something in all of this was worth the time you gave it. Like if it was, subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest. Sleep well. Section 29 Amethyst and the problem of being born late. Amethyst is the crystal gem who emerged 500 years after the war ended. She grew in the prime kindergarten, the same geological formation that Homeworld had used to produce quartz soldiers for the Gem War, but she grew alone. The injectors had been abandoned. The war was over. Nobody was watching. She pushed her way out of the rock and found a world that had already moved on from the thing that had shaped it, and she had to figure out how to exist in that world with no context for what she was supposed to be or what any of it had meant before she arrived. This origin is quietly devastating when you sit with it. Every other major crystal gem character, Rose, Pearl, Garnet, Bismuth, had the war as a formative experience. They lived through it. They made choices in it. They carry its memory and its cost in specific and direct ways. Amethyst does not have that. She has the aftermath. She emerged into a world shaped by something she did not experience, and then spent her existence as part of a family that carried memories she could not share and losses she could not fully understand, because she had not been there for them. She was, from the moment of her emergence, slightly outside the central story of the people she belonged to. The show uses this to do something interesting with Amethyst's character over its run. Her comedy, her loudness, her deflection through humor, her tendency to avoid sustained seriousness, these are not simply personality traits, they are coping mechanisms. They are the tools of someone who learned early that being the odd one out in a group of 3 older people who shared experiences she could not access was a position that required certain strategies to navigate. Making people laugh is a way of being present and necessary and accepted without having to explain why you do not have the same feelings about the things the others have feelings about. Deflecting with jokes is a way of staying in the room without having to acknowledge the parts of the conversation that remind you that you arrived after the important things happened. The arc the show gives Amethyst her relationship with Jasper, who was grown in the beta kindergarten and who represents a version of what Amethyst might have been under different conditions. Her journey toward accepting herself as she emerged, rather than comparing herself to a standard she was never going to meet, is handled with care and without resolution that feels premature. Amethyst, at the end of the series, is not fixed. She is more herself, more willing to be what she is without measuring herself against what she was supposed to be. But the work is ongoing. The show is honest about that. The work of becoming yourself is not something that concludes. It continues. And that is true for Amethyst, as it is true for every other character in a show that, whatever its imperfections, believed consistently and genuinely in the ongoing nature of growth. What Amethyst represents in the fandom's emotional life is worth noting separately. She was, consistently, one of the most popular characters in the community. Her arc, like Paradox, generated warmth rather than conflict. People identified with her in ways that were connected to the specific experience she represented, the experience of being the one who arrived late, of carrying less history than the people around you, of feeling like the newcomer in a group that shared memories and connections you could not reach. These are feelings that are, for many people, very familiar. The show gave them a character who was visibly dealing with those feelings, and the community recognized her and loved her for it. Section 30. What stays? When a show ends, when the last episode airs and the credits roll for the final time and the story is finished, something specific happens to the community that formed around it. The ongoing project of interpretation, of theory, of anticipation ends. The show stops being something that is happening and becomes something that happened. It shifts from present tense to past tense, and the community that was organized around the ongoingness of it has to decide what it is now that the thing organizing it is over. Some fandoms dissolve. The energy that animated them was specifically connected to the show being in production, to the anticipation of new content, and when the anticipation ends, the energy dissipates. Other fandoms persist sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, because the community found in the show's world something that did not need ongoing content to sustain it. Something that was complete enough to return to indefinitely, deep enough to continue yielding new things on each return. The Steven Universe fandom falls into the second category. The show has been over, in its main form, since 2020. The debates continue. The fan art continues. The music continues to be made and shared. People who discovered the show after it ended have been finding their way into the community and having versions of conversations that the earlier community had, bringing new perspectives to a body of work that remains available in its entirety and continues to reward close attention. The controversies have faded in intensity, if not in memory. The Zamii incident is still discussed, still cited, still part of the community's understanding of what it was capable of at its worst. The Jessie Zook affair is remembered. The bismuth discourse resurfaces periodically when someone new encounters the episode and wants to talk about it. The Diamond Redemption debate continues in a lower register than it once occupied. These are not things the fandom forgot. They are things it has absorbed and continued to carry, the way people carry the things that happened in communities they were part of that mattered to them. The show itself remains what it always was. Its songs still do what they do to people. Its characters still feel like people worth caring about. Its ambition, the specific ambition of a show that believed that love and empathy and honesty were not naive positions but radical ones, that believed that the capacity for change was real and worth betting on, that ambition is still visible in every episode, intact, whatever you think of how fully the show achieved it. Rebecca Sugar made something that mattered. The people who made it with her made something that mattered. The people who watched it and loved it and argued about it and made things in response to it, they made something that mattered too. The fandom, for all of its difficulty, was also a creative project that produced real things. Real art, real conversations, real connections, real growth in some of the people who were part of it. What stays at the end of all of this is that it was real. The love was real. The harm was real. The creativity was real. The failures were real. The show was real in the sense that it reached people and changed something in them, which is the only sense of real that matters when you are talking about stories. Steven Universe is done. It is also still there. That is the particular relationship we have with finished things. They are complete and they are available. They give themselves to you the same way every time while you are different, every time you return to them. Whatever you came to this video looking for tonight, if you wanted the full story of the show and the fandom that formed around it, we hope you found something close to it here. If you wanted something to listen to in the dark while the night does its work and your thoughts slow down, we hope this served that too. Drop a like if you found it worthwhile. Leave a comment about which section surprised you, which controversy you remember living through, which character stayed with you longest, or just where in the world you are watching from, and what the night looks like outside your window. Subscribe if you want more of this. Long, careful, unhurried stories about the shows that mattered and the communities that formed around them and everything that happened in between. We will see you in the next one. Sleep well. Section 31. The show that Rebecca Sugar built and what it cost. Understanding Steven Universe fully requires understanding something about how it was made, and not just the high-level facts of its production, not just that Rebecca Sugar was the first solo female creator on Cartoon Network. not just that it ran for 5 seasons and a film and a limited series. What is worth understanding is the specific, sustained, years-long effort that went into making this show be what it was, rather than something smaller or safer or less itself. Because the show that reached the audience was not the show that the network necessarily wanted to fund. It was the show that Sugar and her team fought to make, continuously, from the pilot through the finale, one carefully negotiated creative decision at a time. Sugar has talked in interviews about the experience of pitching the show, about the kinds of questions she was asked in early development, about who the main character was, and whether there was a simpler version of the premise. The premise was not simple. A half-human, half-alien boy being raised by 3 ancient alien warriors while dealing with the legacy of a mother he never met, within a mythology involving a galactic empire and a 5,000-year-old war, and questions about identity and belonging that would not look out of place in literary fiction. This is not a simple premise. But the simplest version of it, the one that would have been most commercially obvious and most institutionally easy, would have been much less interesting and would have had much less to say. The decision to make the show's queer elements not subtext but text, not implication but depiction, however constrained by network restrictions at various points, was a decision that required sustained advocacy. The songs were a decision that required sustained advocacy. The pacing, which was slower and more attentive to small emotional moments than the action-forward format of most Cartoon Network programming, was a decision that required sustained advocacy. The willingness to let storylines remain complex rather than resolving them into simple moral lessons was a decision that required sustained advocacy. Every element of the show that made it distinctive rather than generic was something that someone had to fight for, probably more than once, probably against pushback from people whose job it was to make the show easier to sell to the largest possible audience. This is the reality of making ambitious work within institutional structures. The institution has its own interests, which are real and legitimate, and which do not automatically align with the artist's vision. Navigating that gap requires a specific set of skills, knowing when to push, knowing when to yield, knowing how to find the version of what you want to do that the institution can tolerate, knowing when to create facts on the ground that the institution cannot easily undo. Sugar was evidently good at this. The show exists as evidence of that. But it also means that the show the audience received was the result of a negotiation, and some of what was negotiated away is not visible in the final product, which is to say, the show might have been even more than it was if the conditions had been different. Understanding this is useful for evaluating both the show's achievements and its limitations. When the show fell short of its ambitions, when the pacing felt inconsistent, when a particular character arc felt truncated, when a thematic argument did not get as much room to develop as it needed, some of that shortfall was the result of creative choices, and some of it was the result of institutional constraints, and from the outside it is not always possible to tell which was which. Holding both possibilities in mind produces a more honest engagement with the work than either simply blaming the creators for every limitation or excusing every limitation by reference to institutional pressures. What is visible, unambiguously, is what the show achieved. It achieved a representation of queer love in children's animation that was unprecedented. It achieved a representation of mental health, grief, and trauma that was handled with care and precision. It achieved the first same-sex wedding in its genre on American television. It won awards that recognized it as important work. It reached people who needed it in ways they have documented extensively. These achievements are real, and they are the direct result of the sustained, specific, difficult work of making a show that was determined to be itself even within the constraints it operated under. The cost of that determination was real too. On the people who made it, who navigated years of institutional pressure while also dealing with an extraordinarily intense fandom, on Rebecca Sugar herself, who has spoken about the personal toll of the show's production, on the crew members whose social media presence was affected by fandom dynamics they could not control. Making something ambitious inside a large institution is not easy, and the evidence suggests it was not easy here. The show got made, it got made well, and it cost something. Section 32 Closing Thoughts on a Long Night. If you are still here, if you have stayed through all of this, the controversies and the histories and the long digressions into characters and music, and what it meant to be in this fandom during these years, then, thank you, genuinely. This kind of content asks a lot of an audience. It asks for patience and for sustained attention, and for the willingness to sit with complicated things without demanding that they resolve into something simple. Steven Universe asks the same things of its audience, which is maybe why the kind of person who watches 3 hours of someone talking about a cartoon is often the same kind of person who watched every episode of Steven Universe more than once and noticed things on the third rewatch that they missed on the first two. The show deserves the attention it received, including the critical attention. It deserved the creativity the fandom brought to it, and it deserved the hard questions the fandom asked of it. It even deserved, in some complicated sense, the controversy, because controversy is what happens when something matters enough to people that they are willing to fight about it, and the things worth fighting about are usually the things worth caring about. What the show did not deserve, and what the fandom should carry as a specific lesson it learned the hard way, is the harm that was directed at individuals in the name of caring about the show. The people who were targeted: Paz, Jesse Zook, others who received less attention but were harmed nonetheless, did not deserve what was done to them. The framework that was supposed to protect people was used against them. That is not a complicated moral situation. It is a simple one that produced complicated outcomes, and the simplicity of the moral fact does not diminish the complexity of understanding how it happened. What you do with all of this depends on who you are and what you came here looking for. If you are someone who loves the show and wanted to understand more about what happened around it, we hope this helped. If you are someone who was in the fandom during these years and wanted to see it accounted for, honestly, we hope this felt like an honest accounting. If you are someone who never watched the show and came here out of general interest in fandom history and online community dynamics, we hope the show sounds worth your time, because it is. Steven Universe is still there. Beach City is still on that coast somewhere. The Crystal Temple is still standing. Lion is probably on the front steps. The gems are inside. And somewhere on a road that the show does not show us, Steven is still going. That is enough. That has always been enough. Thank you for being here. Leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to stay. We will see you in the next one. Section 33. The Things That Lasted. There is a particular kind of cultural artifact that does not simply fade when the conversation around it quiets down. It does not disappear when the discourse moves on to the next thing. When the platform that hosted its debates has changed or declined. When the people who were most vocal about it have grown up and shifted their attention. These artifacts persist. They remain available. And they reveal, over time, which parts of the conversation about them were about the moment and which parts were about something more permanent. Steven Universe is one of those artifacts. The show has outlasted the period of its most intense cultural moment, and what it looks like from the distance of a few years is clarifying in ways that proximity made difficult. The things that the discourse fought over most intensely, the specific shipping debates, the specific call-out incidents, the specific arguments about whether a particular episode's pacing was acceptable, these have faded in the way that time-specific intensity always fades. What remains is the work itself, the songs, the characters, the argument the show made about love and change and the possibility of becoming different from what you were built to be. The young people who watched it are not as young as they were. Some of them are adults now who carry specific memories of what it felt like to watch this show at a particular moment in their lives, to be 15 and queer, and watching Ruby and Sapphire, and feeling something click into place that had not clicked before. Those memories belong to those people in a way that the fandom debates do not and cannot. The debates are history. The memories are personal, and the personal survives the historical, usually with more of itself intact. The show also launched careers. Artists, writers, musicians, animators who were in the Steven Universe fandom during their formative years and who went on to make things of their own carried influences from the show that are visible in what they made. The specific visual language, the emotional approach, the willingness to take children's animation seriously as a vehicle for complex feeling, these traveled with people who loved the show into their own work, and some of what they made because of what the show gave them has already reached new audiences who may not know where the influence came from. That is how culture propagates. Not always through direct acknowledgement, but through absorption and transformation, through the way things you loved become part of how you see and what you make. The controversy record of the Steven Universe fandom has also, in its own way, become useful. It is one of the better documented examples of a specific set of dynamics that existed in online fan communities in the 2010s, and the documentation has been used in serious discussions about fan culture, about the design of social media platforms, about the specific vulnerabilities of communities built around media that carries representational significance for marginalized groups. The fandom's worst moments produced, in their aftermath, conversations that were genuinely useful to people trying to understand how online communities fail. The harm was real. The understanding it generated has also been real. Both things can be true. What the fandom was, across the full arc of its existence, was a community of people who cared more, in many cases, than was entirely comfortable for themselves or for others, who cared in ways that were sometimes generous and sometimes destructive, and frequently both simultaneously. Who built something together that was, at its best, genuinely remarkable, a creative culture organized around a piece of children's animation, taking it seriously enough to engage with it as the complex and ambitious work it actually was. That community is not gone. It is less intense than it was during the show's production. It is less centralized, less platform-specific, more dispersed. But people are still out there making fan art of the Crystal Gems, still writing stories set in Beach City, still listening to the show's songs on quiet nights and feeling whatever they feel. The community that formed around this show is one of the things the show produced, alongside the show itself. It is part of the legacy. All of it, the beauty, the difficulty, the creativity, the harm, the love, the anger, the eventual quieting into something more sustainable, is part of what happened when Rebecca Sugar made something that mattered, and people found it, and decided it was worth caring about.